spent 15 years taking care of Mother. And she? She left this house to my brother, who only visited twice a year. That's the real story. The story I can't stop thinking about since the funeral. My mother, Eleanor Miller, never wasted a word. Every syllable she uttered was like a perfectly aimed arrow, finding its mark with Shakespearian precision. The quality of mercy is not strained. Every time I misplaced her reading glasses, a pair perpetually lost, she'd repeat that line, eyes narrowed over her teacup, as if mercy were something I needed to relearn from scratch. For her, forgiveness was a luxury. Now, a month after the funeral, I still hear her voice echoing in these empty rooms. Every wall in this house seems to whisper things she once said or never said. I lived here for 15 years. Left the city. Left my career. Left myself behind. Once I was an editor reading manuscripts, correcting every comma, debating Flaubert on Sunday evenings. Then I switched to medication schedules, pureed food, adult diapers. My apartment in the city gathers dust. And this house, her house, became my entire world. "You're a good girl," she once said. A bit uninspired, perhaps. That was the highest praise I ever received. Today I was just looking for her address book. The mahogany secretary in Mother's study, old, heavy, and always making me feel small. The bottom drawer, where she hid important documents, only she understood. I hadn't dared open it for a long time. But today I did, and I found a thick cream-colored envelope with the embossed lettering, Lockwood and Finch, attorneys at law. I never heard that name. Mother never mentioned it. Her lawyer had always been Mr. Henderson for 40 years. My hands began to tremble. My heart skipped a beat. The envelope wasn't sealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper heavy with officialdom. The first lines were cold, dry legal jargon. Then a sentence leaped out like a knife to my chest. "Do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills." Revoking all prior wills? Impossible. I'd seen the old will. This house was left to me, a small portion to Mark. Mother had said so. Everyone understood it that way. I lived for that. I sacrificed for that. I read on. "To my son, Mark Thomas Miller, I bequeath the entirety of my property located at 12 Willow Creek Lane, including the house and all its contents." I thought I'd misread. I read it again. Then a third time. But the words remained the words. This house where I lived, cleaned, fixed pipes, made Mother's lemon tea for 15 years now belonged to Mark. Mark, the busy son, who'd place flowers on the table and leave after a 40-minute visit. And me? To my daughter, Sarah Eleanor Miller, in recognition of her assistance during my later years, I bequeath the sum of $10,000 and my collection of first edition poetry. Assistance. Help. 15 years of my life called assistance. A little money, enough for half a furnace. A shelf of old poetry. A name briefly mentioned in a strange will. I wasn't a daughter. I was a footnote. My hand shook. The paper rattled. I folded it carefully, as if folding away a rage. Then, I smashed her entire beloved porcelain figurine collection. Those simpering shepherds with smiles as sweet as poison. The sound of shattering echoed clear, crisp, brief, yet more satisfying than any thank you I'd never heard. Mother called me good but uninspired. Now I understood. She didn't need me to be inspired. She needed me to be silent, to endure, and to disappear. The porcelain shards lay scattered across the Persian rug like fallen snow, glinting malevolently in the dim afternoon light filtering through the study window. Mother had cherished those figurines, each simpering shepherd and coy shepherdess a testament to a delicacy she herself rarely exhibited. I remembered once as a child, after spending hours carefully crafting a small brightly painted clay bird, I'd presented it to her, my heart swelling with a shy pride. She'd glanced at it, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes before murmuring, "Quaint Sarah, but perhaps stick to your books. Imagination isn't always practical." The memory, sharp and sudden, twisted in my gut alongside the current devastation. Now her precious, practical figurines were just broken, like the careful, suffocating edifice of my life. The silence that descended after the crash was profound, heavier even than the usual oppressive quiet of this house. It was the silence of something irrevocably altered, For 15 years I had been Sarah Miller, the dutiful daughter, the quiet caregiver, the one who tiptoed around mother's moods and memorized her medication schedule better than my own name. Who was I now? The question hung in the air, as sharp and fragmented as the broken porcelain. I used to be an editor, someone who wrestled with words and debated the merits of Flaubert on rainy Sunday afternoons. That Sarah felt like a ghost from a forgotten lifetime. My phone buzzed on the secretary desk, a sudden vulgar intrusion. I flinched, half expecting it to be Mother's spectral voice, thin and sharp, calling to reprimand me for the damage. It was Mark. Of course it was Mark. His timing, as always, was impeccable in its thoughtlessness. I let it ring once, twice, then with a sigh that felt wrenched from my very core, I picked it up. Sarah? You there? Just calling to coordinate. His voice, breezy and efficient, grated on my raw nerves. About Mother's things, you know. Figured we should get a move on. She always liked things tidy. Tidy, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. The shards of porcelain on the floor seemed to mock his casual efficiency. Yeah. So have you seen the will? He asked it casually, too casually. A prickle of suspicion, sharp and unwelcome, ran down my spine. Yes, Mark. I've seen it. My voice was flat, devoid of the storm raging inside me. Good. So you understand. Mother always had her reasons, Sarah, even if they seem unconventional. She once mentioned something to me about a necessary equilibrium. A necessary equilibrium? The words tore from me louder than I intended. And I suppose I am the weight thrown off the scales to achieve this marvelous equilibrium of hers, Mark? Is that it? A beat of silence on the other end. Then a slight stammer, a crack in his usual polished composure. Now, Sarah, don't get emotional. It's not like that. You're taking it the wrong way. Mother, she wouldn't. She always said you were dependable. Dependable, I echoed, the word landing like another blow. Dependable, uninspired, good. Never brilliant. Never cherished, never seen. And you, Mark? What did she say about you? The favored son who gets the house. That's not fair, Sarah, he said, his voice now tinged with defensiveness, a note I rarely heard. It's complicated. You wouldn't understand the pressures, the expectations. Oh, I understand expectations, Mark. I cut him off, a cold fury hardening my voice. I lived them for 15 years. You visited twice a year. You have no idea. I hung up, my hand trembling slightly as I placed the receiver back on its cradle. His defensiveness, his fumbling words, they didn't soothe me. Instead, they solidified a chilling thought. Mark wasn't just surprised, he was prepared. Perhaps not for my reaction, but for the contents of that will. He knew. Or at least, he suspected enough not to be truly shocked. I looked at the will again, still lying on the polished mahogany. Then very deliberately I picked it up. My hands were steady now, imbued with a strange new resolve. I walked over to Mother's antique letter opener, the one with the tarnished silver handle she'd used to slit open only the most important correspondence. Her lips pursed in concentration. I used it to neatly extract the will from its heavy cream-colored envelope. The document itself, the damning testament to 15 years of my life reduced to assistance. I folded carefully and placed into my handbag. The envelope, crisp and official, bearing the embossed lettering of Lockwood and Finch, I left on the desk. A small act of what? Possession? Defiance? I wasn't sure. But it felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of something that should have been mine. A silent declaration that this was not over. The house felt suffocating. The familiar scent of lavender and old paper, a scent I had once found comforting, a scent intrinsically linked with Mother, now seemed to mock me, to whisper of betrayal. I needed air. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't a Miller, someone whose world hadn't just been appended by a single sheet of cream-colored paper. My fingers, almost of their own accord, dialed a number I knew by heart, a lifeline I hadn't reached for in far too long. Anne. My voice was a hoarse whisper. It's Sarah. I think I need a very stiff drink. And possibly a lawyer. There was a pause, then Anne's calm, steady voice, a welcome anchor in the sudden storm. Sarah? What's wrong? You sound awful. I am awful and, I managed, a dry sob escaping. I think Mother played the most elaborate, cruelest trick on me. And I need you to help me figure out why. And bless her pragmatic, no-nonsense heart, didn't waste time on platitudes. We met at the Gilded Mug, a downtown cafe miles from Mother's neighborhood, a neutral territory where the ghosts of Eleanor Miller's pronouncements couldn't quite reach. The scent of roasted coffee and warm pastries was a welcome antidote to the lavender and dust of the study. So, and began after I'd choked down half a croissant and relayed the story of the will, my voice still laced with a disbelief that felt like a physical weight. The sainted Eleanor, champion of literary fairness and grammatical precision, decided that 15 years of your life amounted to 10 grand and a pile of first editions probably riddled with silverfish? I managed a weak smile. And her assistants, Anne. Don't forget the honorable mention of my assistants. It felt like a posthumous pat on the head for fetching her spectacles. And snorted, stirring her latte with unnecessary vigor. Assistants. Right. While Mark was off conquering the world, or at least, his corner of the import-export market, you were navigating the daily minefield of Eleanor's declining health and escalating pronouncements on the failings of the modern world. Assistance is what you call helping someone find a misplaced comma, Sarah, not this. Her indignation was a warm bomb. Legally, and continued, her tone shifting to the brisk efficiency that made her a formidable contracts lawyer. It's her will. Unless you can prove undue influence or diminished capacity, which, knowing Eleanor, is a snowball's chance in, well, you know. I nodded. Mother, even in her fuzziest moments, had a mind like a steel trap, especially when it came to what she considered hers. So I just accept it? That my brother, who barely remembered her birthday half the time, inherits the house I've poured my life into keeping afloat. The bitterness was a raw wound in my throat, and leaned forward. Accept the legal document? Probably. Accept the narrative that you're an afterthought? Absolutely not. Her gaze was sharp. This isn't just about a house, Sarah. This is about what Eleanor's choice says about your worth in her eyes. Or more accurately, what you think it says. That pricked. What do you mean? Eleanor was complex, and said carefully, choosing her words like she was defusing a bomb. Brilliant, yes. Loving in her own peculiar, often barbed way? Also yes. But easy. Or always fair. Not in my recollection. Remember that disastrous Thanksgiving when she critiqued your stuffing based on a recipe from a 17th century poet no one had ever heard of? A reluctant laugh escaped me, and then declared my gravy an affront to poultry everywhere. The memory, once infuriating, now held a strange, distant absurdity. Exactly, Anne said. She loved you, Sarah. Fiercely, I think. But she also wielded her intellect like a weapon, and sometimes those closest get hit by friendly fire. The question isn't just what was in that will. The question is what was in her head. And more importantly, what's in yours now? Her words stayed with me long after I left the cafe. What was in Mother's head? The woman who could dissect T.S. Eliot with surgical precision, but couldn't seem to manage a simple unadorned thank you for years of care. The woman whose approval I'd craved like a desert wanderer craves water, only to be handed a thimbleful of assistance. I drove back to the house, Mark's house, the descriptor now a bitter pill. The scattered porcelain was still on the study floor. I knelt, carefully picking up the larger shards. A shepherdess, her painted-on smile now chipped and lopsided, stared up at me. A bit uninspired perhaps, but good. Mother's voice clear as day. Was it possible that her criticisms weren't always meant to wound, but were her clumsy academic way of engaging? Of pushing me? Or was that just me 15 years later, trying to find a kinder narrative for a deep unacknowledged hurt? I didn't have the answers. Not yet. But as I swept the last of the porcelain into a dustpan, a tiny rebellious thought took root. My worth wasn't written in her will, nor was it defined by her often acerbic pronouncements. It had to be found somewhere else. Somewhere inside me. And for the first time in a very long time, instead of the familiar ache of inadequacy, I felt a flicker. Not of hope, not yet. But of possibility. The address book could wait. Tonight I decided I was going to open that box of my old editorial notes, the ones I'd packed away 15 years ago, just to see what was still there. Thursday arrived cloaked in a thin, persistent drizzle, the kind of gray sky that mirrored the muted landscape of my current emotions. The faculty club, a place I hadn't set foot in since my own thesis defense 2 decades prior, Felt like stepping into a time capsule. Dark wood, hushed tones, the faint scent of old leather, and even older academic debates. Professor Alastair Finch, however, hadn't aged a day beyond acquiring a more distinguished silver at his temples. His eyes, behind a pair of surprisingly modern frames, were as sharp and unervingly perceptive as I remembered. "Sarah," he said, his voice a dry Cambridge rasp that could still make a graduate student quail, "you look embattled. Coffee or something stronger?" "Coffee for now, Alastair," I managed, settling into a worn armchair opposite him, though embattled is a rather anemic description for my current state of mind. He chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Eleanor Miller had a way of leaving formidable ripples in her wake, even, it seems, from beyond the veil. "So Lockwood and Finch. Tell me." I laid out the facts as neutrally as I could. The discovery of the new will, the drastically altered inheritance, the unfamiliar law firm. I didn't delve into the 15 years of assistance, the emotional shrapnel. Finch was a man of intellect. He'd see the human drama beneath the legal framework soon enough. He listened without interruption, fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on a point just past my shoulder, a habit I recalled from countless seminars. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, the only sound the clinking of cups from the nearby dining room. "Lockwood and Finch," he mused finally. "Not exactly known for their sentimental handling of family estates. More of a corporate bulldog if memory serves. Did Eleanor mention any new business ventures? Any significant financial restructuring before she passed?" I frowned. "Not to me. She kept her financial affairs notoriously close to her chest. Always said, a woman's purse, like her opinions, Sarah, is her own private sanctuary." Another one of her pronouncements, delivered with the gravity of a papal bull. Finch nodded slowly. A sanctuary indeed. Eleanor, for all her literary sensibilities, had an astute, if somewhat unorthodox, financial mind. She once cornered the market on first editions of a rather obscure metaphysical poet, much to the chagrin of several well-funded university libraries. Made a small fortune when his work unexpectedly came back into vogue. This was news to me. Mother? A shrewd investor? The woman who haggled over the price of broccoli at the farmer's market? "The point, Sarah," Finch continued, leaning forward slightly, "is that Eleanor rarely did anything without a complex, multi-layered reason. Sometimes those layers were so deep, even she might have forgotten the original one. This transfer to Mark, while on the surface it appears inequitable, to use a mild term." He paused, letting the understatement hang in the air. "I would be very surprised if there wasn't a meticulously constructed, albeit possibly infuriating, logic behind it. Logic like rewarding the son who barely called over the daughter who changed her bedpans?" The bitterness was back, sharp and acrid. "Perhaps," Finch said, his gaze direct now. "Or perhaps a logic you haven't yet discerned. Eleanor played chess, Sarah, not checkers. Did she ever mention setting up trusts? Complex tax shelters? Protecting assets from anything she deemed a threat to her legacy? Trusts? Tax shelters?" This was a world away from unpublished poets and the precise temperature for Earl Grey tea. "No," I said slowly. "She spoke of legacy in terms of her books, her ideas. Not this. Ideas need funding, Sarah. Legacies need protecting, sometimes in ways that aren't immediately apparent to the designated heirs of the poetry." He sipped his coffee. "Lockwood and Finch specialize in precisely that kind of creative estate planning, often for clients who wish for discretion above all else." He offered no solutions, no easy condemnation of Mother's actions. Instead, Alastair Finch, in his inimitable way, had handed me a more complicated puzzle. Mother wasn't just being capricious or cruel. She might have been strategic, calculating, for reasons I couldn't yet fathom. Reasons that might have nothing or everything to do with me. As I left the faculty club, the drizzle had stopped, but the gray sky remained. My anger hadn't dissipated, but it was now overlaid with an unsettling layer of confusion. Meeting Mark on Saturday suddenly felt less like a straightforward battle for my due, and more like stepping into a fog, unsure of what lay hidden beneath the surface of Mother's final baffling act. The simple injustice was becoming decidedly, uncomfortably, complex. Perhaps that was Eleanor Miller's true legacy. A perfectly constructed enigma, designed to be unraveled long after the author had taken her final bow. And I, her uninspired but good daughter, was apparently the one left to decipher the damn thing. Saturday morning dawned offensively bright, a stark contrast to the gray fog of uncertainty Professor Finch had so expertly instilled in me. Mother's house. No, I had to stop thinking of it that way. Mark's house felt less like a home and more like an archaeological dig site where I was unearthing fragments of a life I only thought I knew. The scent of old roses from the neglected garden mingled with the mustiness of packed boxes, a perfume of regret and unresolved questions. Mark arrived, not at 10 sharp as agreed, but at 10:30, full of breezy apologies about city traffic, that I knew for a fact was non-existent on a Saturday heading out of town. He carried 2 large empty cardboard boxes and an air of someone determined to get an unpleasant task over with quickly. "Morning, sis," he said, already heading towards the study. "Ready to tackle the literary archives of Eleanor Miller? Or do we start with the porcelain graveyard you created?" A small challenging smile played on his lips. So he'd noticed. Or perhaps, more likely, the cleaning lady, Mrs. Gable, had reported my minor act of ceramic rebellion with her usual dramatic flair. "The porcelain met with a difference of critical opinion," I said, matching his light tone with one of my own, honed by years of faculty lounge parries with Mother. "As for the archives, I assume you're here for more than just the first editions, Mark. Perhaps some illuminating financial statements? Trust documents, even." He paused, one hand on the study doorknob. "Financials? Sarah, Mother's finances were always straightforward. A professor's pension, some modest investments. Mr. Henderson handled all that. You know that." He sounded almost genuinely puzzled, which was in itself puzzling. Was it possible he truly didn't know about Lockwood and Finch, about the creative estate planning Alastair had hinted at? Or was he a more accomplished actor than I'd ever given him credit for? We started in the study, the room most densely packed with Mother's intellectual life. Books overflowed from shelves, cascaded from desks, lay in precarious stacks on the floor. Each one felt like a small piece of her, sharp-edged and demanding. Mark, true to form, was ruthlessly efficient, creating piles for donate, sell, and keep. The last pile, I noted with a familiar pang, being significantly smaller. "This edition of The Wasteland," he said, holding up a slim, battered volume. "Professor Albright from Yale offered her a small fortune for this back in the 90s. She refused. Said it had sentimental value. Can't imagine what." He tossed it onto the sell pile. My breath caught. I remembered that book. Mother hadn't told Mark or anyone why it was special. It was the copy Dad had given her on their first anniversary, the inscription hidden on the inside cover. "To my dearest Eleanor, may our wasteland always bloom. T." A rare, unguarded moment of tenderness from my stoic father, one Mother had cherished in her own fiercely private way. And Mark, in his haste to monetize her memory, was about to discard it. "Actually, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly firm, "I'll take that one." I rescued it from the sell pile before he could argue, tucking it into my own small box of keepsakes. His shrug was indifferent. One less dusty book for him to deal with. We worked in a strained silence for a while, punctuated only by the rustle of paper and Mark's occasional impatient sighs. He was focused on tangible assets, on clearing out space. I found myself drawn to the intangible. A pressed flower in a dictionary, a faded postcard from a long-dead colleague, a grocery list with a line of poetry scribbled on the back. These were the real clues to Eleanor Miller, the woman, not just the formidable academic. Clues Mark seemed determined to ignore, or perhaps had never been equipped to see. "So," Mark said, breaking the silence as he taped up a box labeled Academic Journals, Questionable Value. "Have you thought any more about the house? About arrangements?" I straightened up, a stack of Mother's handwritten lecture notes in my hand. Notes so dense with annotations they were practically unreadable, yet crackling with her fierce intelligence. "Arrangements for your house, you mean?" I met his gaze. "Actually, Mark, I've been thinking a lot about Mother's arrangements, particularly her dealings with a firm called Lockwood and Finch. Does that name ring any bells for you?" The way his hand stilled on the packing tape, the almost imperceptible tightening around his jaw. Oh yes, the bell was ringing. Loud and clear. And suddenly, this dusty, grief-filled room felt less like a tomb and more like the scene of an interrogation I was just beginning to conduct. Mark's hand, indeed, stilled on the packing tape. For a fraction of a second, the breezy confidence he wore like a bespoke suit seemed to falter. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by an expression of mild, almost patronizing bewilderment. "Lockwood and Finch?" he echoed, drawing out the syllables as if tasting an exotic, slightly suspect fruit. "Sounds like a brand of expensive cigars, not Mother's solicitors. You're sure you've got the name right, Sarah? Old Henderson handled everything for decades. Probably just some junk mail you found." He gestured dismissively towards the pile of papers I'd been sorting. "It was on their official letterhead, Mark," I said, my voice level, betraying none of the sudden sharp certainty his micro-reaction had ignited in me. He knew the name, or at least it meant something to him, and it was attached to a document detailing Mother's rather surprising testamentary decisions. Decisions Mr. Henderson, by his own admission when I called him yesterday, knew nothing about until after the fact. That got his attention. He put down the tape gun. "You called Henderson? Sarah, what exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Mark. I'm asking questions." I picked up a small, intricately carved wooden bird from Mother's desk. A forgotten gift from a trip to Scandinavia she'd taken before her illness truly took hold. Questions like, why would Mother, a creature of habit and fierce loyalty, suddenly change solicitors for something as significant as her will, without mentioning it to anyone, especially not to the daughter who managed her every waking, and often sleeping, moment for 15 years? He ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as his go-to when feeling cornered. "Look, Sarah, you're upset. It's understandable. The will, it was a shock. For me too, in some ways. A masterful touch of feigned solidarity. But Mother was elderly. Sometimes people do things that don't entirely make sense towards the end. Maybe she was confused. Maybe Henderson was slipping. Confused enough to find a new high-powered law firm specializing in creative estate planning and asset protection. According to a very reliable source?" I countered, quoting Alistair Finch without naming him. "Confused enough to meticulously structure a transfer that, by all accounts, seems designed to achieve a very specific, very clear outcome? Mother might have been many things, Mark, but muddle-headed about her own affairs was never one of them. Not even on her worst days." His face tightened. The patronizing calm was fraying. "What reliable source? Who have you been talking to?" The shift from feigned concern to sharp suspicion was telling. "Just someone who understands the difference between a grieving daughter and a convenient narrative, Mark." I set the wooden bird down. "Someone who also finds it interesting, as you put it, that these particular solicitors were involved." He stared at me, his blue eyes so eerily like hers narrowed. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic, the house holding its breath around us. I could almost feel Mother's presence, a silent, ironic observer to this drawing-room drama she herself had orchestrated. "Lockwood and Finch," he said finally, his voice low and devoid of its earlier breeziness. "Mother mentioned them once. Something about protecting her literary legacy, ensuring her papers, her unpublished works went to the right archives, not just scattered. She was always obsessed with how history would remember her. Her literary legacy sounded plausible. Mother had been obsessed with her academic standing. But did that explain disinheriting the daughter who'd transcribed half those papers, who'd proofread her last monograph through bleary, exhausted eyes? Felt like a piece of the puzzle, yes, but not the whole picture. More like a carefully placed fig leaf over something larger, something still hidden. "Her literary legacy," I echoed. "And I suppose transferring the physical house, the primary asset, to you was just a footnote to that grand intellectual plan? A practical measure to ensure you, as the more financially astute sibling, could manage the upkeep of her sacred texts." My voice dripped sarcasm I didn't bother to conceal. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a flicker of genuine anger, or perhaps fear, in his eyes. The well-rehearsed arguments, the smooth deflections, seemed to be failing him. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a tiny cold thrill. Not of victory, but of proximity. I was getting closer to something, and Mark knew it. The silence in the study stretched, taut and vibrating, like a high-tension wire about to snap. Mark stared at me, the polished veneer of the successful businessman cracking to reveal something raw and defensive underneath. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let him off the hook with another platitude or a convenient client emergency. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath, the fight visibly draining out of him, replaced by a weary resignation that, for a fleeting moment, almost mirrored my own. "All right, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "Lockwood and Finch. Yes, Mother consulted them. It was complicated." "Complicated how?" I pressed, keeping my tone even though my heart was hammering. He walked over to the window, staring out at the overgrown rose garden, his back to me. A classic avoidance tactic. She was worried towards the end. About things. The economy. The stability of her investments. She wanted to ensure her legacy, as she called it, was protected. Not just her books but everything. She felt the house, this land, needed to be in hands that could actively manage it, grow its value. "Meaning not my hands," I stated, the words tasting like ash. "Because I was too busy providing assistance to actually manage anything of value. Is that it?" He whipped around, a flash of genuine anger in his eyes now. "Don't put words in my mouth, Sarah. Or Mother's. It wasn't about you not being capable. It was about practicality. You're an editor, a scholar at heart. You were never interested in property development or aggressive investment strategies. I am. It's what I do." So this was her pragmatic solution? To disinherit the daughter who nursed her through every fever, every fall, every moment of terror in the night, in favor of the son who sent a generic fruit basket for Christmas. My voice was rising, the carefully constructed calm beginning to crumble. Before Mark could retort, a shadow fell across the doorway. Mrs. Gable, the cleaning lady, stood there, her face a mask of polite apology, but her eyes sharp with an avid curiosity that had probably kept her eavesdropping for the past 10 minutes. She held a small lacquered wooden box. "Excuse me, Miss Sarah, Mr. Mark," she said, her voice a stage whisper. "I was just dusting Mrs. Miller's bedside table and I found this. Tucked right under her pillow it was. Didn't look like her usual jewelry box. Thought you might want to see it." The box was old, perhaps Chinese lacquer, intricately carved with faded peonies. I didn't recognize it. Mother's tastes had always run to simpler, more austere things. Mark looked equally perplexed. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," I said, taking the box. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and the clasp was stiff. "That will be all for now." She curtsied, an anachronistic gesture that always amused Mother, and retreated, no doubt to report this new development to the neighborhood watch of busybodies. Mark and I looked at each other, then at the box. The tension of our argument momentarily suspended by this new, unexpected object. "Well," he said, an uncharacteristic note of anticipation in his voice. "Aren't you going to open it?" My fingers fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open with a faint click. Inside, nestled on faded silk, wasn't jewelry. It was a collection of small, smooth gray stones, each one with a single Chinese character painted on it in delicate black ink. And beneath them, a folded piece of rice paper brittle with age. I carefully unfolded the paper. It was a letter, or perhaps a journal entry, written in Mother's familiar, precise hand, but in a language I didn't recognize. Not English, not French or Latin, the languages of her academic life. It looked Asian. "What in God's name is that?" Mark breathed, leaning closer, his earlier animosity forgotten in the face of this shared enigma. I stared at the elegant alien script. Mother, the quintessential New England intellectual, the scholar of Western canon, had a secret. A secret hidden beneath her pillow, written in a language neither of her children could understand. The carefully constructed narrative of Eleanor Miller, the one I'd lived with, rebelled against, and mourned, had just developed a plot twist no one could have predicted. And those smooth, painted stones felt like keys to a door I never even knew existed. The study, moments before a battleground of accusations and resentments, now held a different kind of tension. The electric hum of a shared, profound mystery. Mark, who had been a breath away from launching another defensive salvo about Mother's unimpeachable logic, was now staring at the strange script on the rice paper with an expression I could only describe as utterly bewildered. It was, I realized with a jolt, probably the first time in our adult lives we'd looked at something together without the immediate filter of our ingrained sibling rivalry. Well, I said, breaking the silence, my voice softer than I intended. It appears Mother had more esoteric passions than just obscure Icelandic poets. Mark ran a hand over his face, the fight seemingly forgotten. I don't understand. She never spoke any other language. Not that I ever heard. Did Dad know about this? A good question. Dad, Thomas Miller, a man of quiet routines and even quieter emotions, had passed away 5 years before Mother. If he'd known this secret, he'd taken it with him. If he did, I said. He was a better keeper of secrets than both of us combined. We stood there for a moment, two estranged siblings united by a common bafflement. The painted stones in the lacquered box felt suddenly significant, like runes holding an ancient code. Picked one up. It was cool and smooth against my palm. The black character on it was elegant, a series of delicate brushstrokes that meant nothing to me. What do we do with this? Mark finally asked, his voice subdued. The question hung in the air. This wasn't about the house anymore, or not just about the house. This was about Eleanor Miller, a woman we thought we knew, who had apparently lived a whole other life, or at least harbored a whole other world within these familiar walls. We find out what it means, I said, a new kind of resolve hardening within me. The anger over the will hadn't vanished, but it was now overlaid with an intense, almost academic curiosity. Mother had left a puzzle, and whether she intended it as a final act of obfuscation or a coded message, I was suddenly determined to solve it. Those characters, they look like they could be Chinese or Japanese perhaps. Mark peered closer. You think? Mother never traveled to Asia. Europe, yes. Endlessly. But the Far East? Doesn't sound like her at all. Exactly, I said. Which makes it all the more interesting. I carefully placed the stones and the letter back into the box, closing the clasp. I'm meeting Professor Finch on Thursday. He's an expert in deciphering complex narratives. Perhaps he can shed some light, or point us in the right direction. Mark looked surprised. You're still meeting with him? After this? He gestured vaguely at the box, then around the room, as if the entire context of our conflict had just been rendered absurd by this new discovery. Especially after this, I corrected. The will might explain what Mother did, Mark. This? I tapped the lacquered box. This might explain why. Or at least, it might explain a part of Eleanor Miller neither of us ever knew. And frankly, I think we both deserve to understand that, don't you? He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Fine. Find out what you can. But Sarah, he paused, his gaze hardening slightly, a reminder that the battle over the house was merely on hold, not over. This doesn't change the fundamentals of the will. Lockwood and Finch are perfectly legitimate. We'll see about that, I said, my own resolve undiminished. But for now, let's agree on one thing. No decisions about Mother's literary legacy, or anything else in this study, until we understand what these stones are trying to tell us. He gave another stiff nod. The fragile, unexpected alliance born of shared confusion held, for now. As he left, promising to return the following weekend to continue sorting, a phrase that now felt ludicrously inadequate, I carried the lacquered box into the kitchen. I made myself a cup of strong tea, Mother's favorite Earl Grey, and sat down, the box before me like a locked door to an unknown room in a house I thought I knew intimately. The game, it seemed, had just acquired several new, perplexing, and utterly irresistible layers. The faculty club, when I returned on Thursday, felt less like a time capsule and more like an antechamber to one of Mother's more labyrinthine academic puzzles. Professor Finch, already seated at the same quiet corner table, greeted me with a nod that managed to be both welcoming and discerning. The lacquered box sat between us on the polished mahogany, a silent, enigmatic third guest. Alistair, I began, after the ritual of coffee had been observed, our previous conversation about Lockwood and Finch was illuminating. But it seems Mother left behind more than just a creatively structured will. I opened the box, revealing the smooth, painted stones and the brittle rice paper letter. My brother and I found this under her pillow. Neither of us recognizes the script, nor these stones. Finch leaned forward, his earlier languor replaced by an intense, scholarly focus. He picked up one of the stones, turning it over in his long fingers, his brow furrowed. He then carefully unfolded the rice paper, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar characters. The silence stretched, filled only with the distant clatter of cutlery. "Fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than to me. He selected another stone, then another, arranging them in a specific sequence on the table. "The script is indeed East Asian. The brushwork on these stones, it's not amateur. There's discipline here, a certain intentionality." He looked up at me, his gaze piercing. Eleanor Miller, a student of Eastern calligraphy? Or perhaps, a keeper of someone else's very profound secrets. My mind reeled. Mother, the staunch Euroclassicist, involved with Eastern calligraphy? It seemed as improbable as her suddenly developing a taste for reality television. I have no idea," I confessed. She never mentioned any such interest. Her collections were all Western, first editions, Victorian mourning jewelry, obscure European poetry. Finch tapped the rice paper. "This letter, the paper itself is old. Very fine. The ink too. This isn't a recent affectation, Sarah. This speaks of something long held, deeply personal." He pointed to a recurring character on several stones. "This symbol here. It's a variant of an older form of show. So, longevity, long life. But its placement, the way it's rendered, it's almost a signature. Or a prayer." "A prayer?" Mother, who once declared organized religion an insult to the well-stocked mind. The contradictions were piling up, creating a portrait of Eleanor Miller far more complex and contradictory than the one I had carried for 52 years. "Professor," I began, then hesitated. "Alistair, do you know what this means? Can you read it?" He shook his head slowly. "My field is metaphysical poets, Sarah, not ancient sinology. But I know someone who might. Dr. Evelyn Hayes, over in the Asian Studies Department. She owes me a rather large favor involving a misattributed Dawn manuscript." A rare dry smile touched his lips. Eleanor knew Evelyn, I believe. They served on a rather tedious university senate committee together for a year or two, much to Eleanor's vocal displeasure. Evelyn Hayes. Another name from Mother's orbit I'd barely registered. The thought of approaching yet another academic, another potential keeper of Mother's secrets, was daunting. But the image of those enigmatic stones, the elegant, unreadable script, was a far more powerful pull. Could you make an introduction?" I asked. "Consider it done," Finch said, already reaching for his phone. "Eleanor Miller's final puzzle. I must admit, Sarah, it's more intriguing than most of the doctoral theses I've had to endure lately." As he made the call, I looked again at the lacquered box. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It wasn't even just about uncovering Mother's secret reasons for the will. It was about understanding the woman herself, the intricate, hidden patterns of her life. For the first time, I felt a strange kinship with her intellectual fervor, her love for a well-constructed mystery. It was an uncomfortable, disorienting feeling, like finding a piece of yourself in the last place you expected. Evelyn Hayes. Another key, perhaps, to another locked room in the sprawling, uncatalogued museum of Eleanor Miller's existence. And the meeting with Mark, now less than 48 hours away, suddenly felt like a secondary plotline, a practical, messy epilogue to a far more profound and deeply personal quest. The Asian Studies Department was tucked away in a quieter, older corner of the university campus, a world removed from the bustling modernity of the business school where I'd earned my degree. Professor Finch had, true to his word, arranged the meeting. Dr. Evelyn Hayes's office smelled faintly of sandalwood and old paper, a scent both calming and exotic. She was a woman perhaps a decade older than me, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners and an aura of serene intelligence that was a stark contrast to Mother's more combative intellectual style. "Professor Finch mentioned your mother, Eleanor Miller," Dr. Hayes said, her voice soft but clear after I'd introduced myself and presented the lacquered box. "A formidable scholar. We served on that dreadful budget committee together. She once filibustered for an entire hour over the correct semicolon placement in the meeting minutes. I rather admired her tenacity, if not her grammatical pedantry." A small genuine smile. This was a side of Mother's colleagues I rarely saw, one that acknowledged her difficulty but also her underlying strengths. I opened the box, laying out the stones and the brittle rice paper letter. Dr. Hayes leaned forward, her initial polite interest sharpening into something more focused, more akin to the look Alistair had when faced with a particularly naughty dawn sonnet. She picked up a stone, her fingertips tracing the black character. "These are quite something," she murmured, selecting another. The script on the stones is Zhuan Shu, an ancient Chinese seal script. Beautifully executed. Each stone seems to represent a single concept, a virtue perhaps. This one, she held up the stone Finch had identified, is indeed show longevity. This one, she pointed to another, is fu, good fortune, happiness. And this is shishi, joy, often double joy, as in marriage. Marriage, joy. These were not words I readily associated with mother, especially not in any hidden, calligraphic form. Dr. Hayes then turned her attention to the letter, handling the fragile rice paper with an almost reverent care. She read silently for several long minutes, her brow occasionally furrowing, a soft sound escaping her lips now and then, a sigh, a quiet hum of understanding. The air in the small office grew thick with unspoken history. Finally she looked up, her kind eyes now holding a new depth, a hint of sadness. "This letter, Sarah," she began gently, "is not a philosophical treatise or an academic paper. It appears to be a series of unsent letters, or perhaps a continuous journal entry, written over a period of time, addressed to someone named Lin. The name meant nothing. Another ghost from a life I hadn't known. It speaks of a great love," Dr. Hayes continued, her voice even softer. "A profound connection. It speaks of shared dreams, of art, of a quiet life that was anticipated. And then it speaks of a great sorrow, an enforced separation. There are references to a crossing of waters, to a promise broken by circumstance, not by heart." My head was spinning. Mother. A great love? Enforced separation? This was the stuff of the Victorian novels she'd so often derided for their excessive sentimentality. The woman who had critiqued my every teenage crush with merciless logic, who had seemed to view romantic love as a rather tiresome illogical distraction. Had she herself harbored a secret epic romance? "There are also passages here," Dr. Hayes said, pointing to a section, "that speak of protecting something, or someone, of making difficult choices to ensure a form of security. It's fragmented, emotional, not always clear. But the undercurrent is one of profound sacrifice, made out of what seems like a desperate, protective love." She paused. "And many of these entries, Sarah, are dated from around the time she would have been in her late 20s, early 30s, before she met your father, before my father. A whole secret history, a whole secret heart, beating beneath the stern academic exterior I had known. The carefully constructed image of Eleanor Miller, the one I had spent my life reacting to, was crumbling before my eyes, replaced by a stranger, a young woman who had loved and lost and apparently made monumental hidden sacrifices. What does this have to do with the will?" I finally managed, the question a hoarse whisper. Dr. Hayes looked at me with deep compassion. "I cannot say for certain, of course. That is for legal minds. But Sarah, the woman who wrote these words, she was capable of making profound, perhaps even ruthless, decisions if she believed them necessary to protect what or whom she held most dear. Even if those decisions caused pain, even if they were misunderstood." I left Dr. Hayes's office feeling like the ground had fundamentally shifted beneath my feet. The anger at Mark, the sting of the inheritance, it all felt smaller now, almost insignificant compared to this chasm of unknown history that had just opened up. Mother's literary legacy wasn't just about books and papers. It was about a life, a love, a loss I had never known. And the meeting with Mark on Saturday loomed not as a battle over a house, but as an encounter with someone who might, just might, hold another piece of this devastating, heartbreaking puzzle. Or perhaps be as lost in it as I now was. Saturday morning dawned offensively bright, a stark contrast to the gray fog of uncertainty Professor Finch had so expertly instilled in me. Mother's house. No, I had to stop thinking of it that way. Mark's house felt less like a home and more like an archaeological dig site where I was unearthing fragments of a life I only thought I knew. The scent of old roses from the neglected garden mingled with the mustiness of packed boxes, a perfume of regret and unresolved questions. Mark, when he arrived, only 15 minutes late this time, a marked improvement, found me not amidst a battlefield of sorted boxes, but sitting quietly in Mother's armchair in the study, the lacquered box open on the desk before me. The rice paper letter and the stones were arranged as Dr. Hayes had shown me. "Still contemplating Mother's oriental phase?" he quipped, though his usual easy sarcasm sounded a little forced. He glanced at the stones, then quickly away, as if they made him uneasy. An interesting reaction. "I'm contemplating Mother," I said. "The one we apparently never knew. Did she ever mention a Lynn to you, Mark? Or talk about learning calligraphy? Or perhaps a profound connection that predated Dad?" He scoffed a little too loudly. "Mother? Involved in some clandestine pre-Dad romance? Sarah, you're letting your imagination run away with you. She was Eleanor Miller, formidable academic scourge of sloppy syntax. Not the heroine of a tragic opera." He started opening one of the empty boxes he'd brought. "All business again. Let's just get this over with, shall we? The sooner we clear this place out, the sooner we can both move on." Move on. As if one could simply pack up a lifetime of secrets and misunderstandings into a cardboard box and label it donate. His dismissal, so quick, so absolute, felt wrong. Either he was a remarkably good actor, or he was as blind as I had been. And for some reason, the latter possibility felt more unsettling. If Mother had hidden this vast, secret part of herself from both her children, what did that say about her capacity for connection? Or her reasons for the will? We began the grim task of sorting through Mother's bedroom, a space even more intensely personal than the study. Her clothes still hung in the closet, smelling faintly of her lavender and old cedar. Mark, predictably, was all for ruthless culling. Good will pile for most of this, right? No one wants Mother's tweed skirts. I found myself pausing over a faded silk kimono tucked away in a bottom drawer. A garment utterly out of character with the Eleanor I knew. It was embroidered with peonies, similar to the ones on the lacquered box. My breath caught. "Did Mother ever wear this?" I asked, holding it up. Mark glanced at it, then did a double take. "What on earth is that? Looks like something out of a costume drama. Never saw her in anything remotely like it. Probably some bizarre gift she never threw away. Toss it." But I couldn't. I folded it carefully, placing it with the lacquered box in my to investigate further pile, a pile that was growing alarmingly larger than Mark's neat stacks for donation and sale. As we worked, the conversation, or lack thereof, was telling. Mark talked about property values, about getting the house on the market before the winter slowdown. I found myself looking for more clues, more whispers from Mother's hidden life. A small, worn Chinese-English dictionary tucked behind a row of Shakespeare. A tiny, almost invisible ink stain on the carpet beneath her writing desk, as if from a dropped calligraphy brush. Each discovery was a small jolt, a quiet refutation of the woman I thought I'd spent 15 years understanding. "About the will, Mark," I said later as we were taking a break, surrounded by boxes that felt like accusations. "The house. You're really just going to sell it?" Without a second thought. He looked at me, exasperated. "Sarah, we've been over this. It's what Mother wanted. And frankly, it's a lot of upkeep. I have my own life, my own commitments. I can't be driving down here every weekend to mow the lawn." "No," I said softly, more to myself than to him. "I suppose you can't." The old anger was still there, but it was muted now, overshadowed by a deeper, more complex emotion. Sadness, yes, but also a burgeoning, almost desperate need to understand the woman who had made these choices, who had lived these secret lives. "You know, Mark," I said, standing up and dusting off my hands, "you can have the house. Do whatever you want with it. Sell it, rent it out, turn it into a shrine to whatever you think Mother's legacy was." He stared at me, speechless for once. You're serious? Just like that?" "Just like that," I confirmed, my gaze drifting to the lacquered box. "Because I think I'm beginning to realize that Mother's true inheritance, the one she really left behind, isn't made of bricks and mortar. And it certainly wasn't detailed by Lockwood and Finch." Picked up the box. "And that," I said, meeting his confused gaze, "is the legacy I intend to claim." Mark stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking in ancient Sumerian, which, given the contents of the lacquered box, felt strangely appropriate. The concept of a legacy beyond bank statements and property deeds was clearly foreign territory for him. You're just giving up the house?" he stammered, the empty cardboard box slipping slightly in his grasp. After all that. The lawyers, the arguments? I'm not giving up anything, Mark, I said, the lacquered box held securely in my hands. It felt like an anchor in the swirling currents of my confusion. I'm choosing what's worth fighting for. And right now, understanding Mother seems infinitely more valuable than haggling over who gets her collection of chipped Wedgwood. He shook his head, a look of genuine bafflement mixed with what I suspected was profound relief. Well, if you're sure. Saves us all a lot of unpleasantness. He quickly recovered his businessman composure. I'll have Henderson draw up the papers. A quitclaim deed, perhaps. Clean and simple. Clean and simple. Nothing about Mother, I was rapidly discovering, was ever clean or simple. The following Monday, armed with high-resolution photographs of the stones and the letter, I wasn't letting the originals out of my sight. I met Dr. Evelyn Hayes in her sun-drenched office. The scent of sandalwood was stronger this time. Or perhaps I was just more attuned to subtleties I'd previously missed. Dr. Hayes spread the photographs across her cluttered desk, her expression one of absorbed concentration. The stones, as I mentioned, are auspicious symbols. Longevity, fortune, joy, often associated with blessings for a new beginning, a significant life event. She tapped a photo of a stone with a particularly intricate character. This one is Yuanfan, Yanfun. It's a difficult concept to translate directly. It implies a binding destiny, a karmic connection, often between two people. A fate that, once set in motion, cannot be easily undone. Yuanfan. A binding destiny. With whom? Lin. The name echoed in my mind, a whisper from a past I couldn't access. Dr. Hayes then turned to the photographs of the letter. She used a magnifying glass, her brow furrowed. The script is cursive and quite old. It will take time. But there are phrases here. She paused, looking up at me, her kind eyes shadowed with a shared empathy. One recurring line, translated loosely, says something like, "The ink bleeds with the sorrow of 1,000 uncrossed miles." 1,000 uncrossed miles. The phrase resonated with a deep, aching familiarity, though I couldn't place why. It spoke of separation, of longing. Mother's longing? She was writing about someone she loved, wasn't she? I asked the question, barely a breath. Someone she lost. Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. It seems so. There are references to the scent of plum blossoms in a courtyard I will never see again. And to a voice like the summer wind, now only an echo in my heart. It's profoundly melancholic. And yet, shot through with an incredible strength, a determination to endure. Endure. That, at least, sounded like the Eleanor Miller I knew. The iron will, the unbending resolve. But this hidden core of romantic sorrow? It was like discovering a secret, vibrant garden blooming in the heart of a fortress. Can you translate the whole thing? I asked. How long would it take? It's not a simple task, Dr. Hayes admitted. The language is poetic, elusive, and some parts are faded. But I can try. It will require patience. She looked at me. And perhaps, Sarah, it will require you to learn a little of this world your mother inhabited in secret. The context, the symbolism, they are as important as the words themselves. Learn her mother's secret world. The idea was both daunting and strangely compelling. For so long, I had defined myself in opposition to Eleanor Miller, or in weary service to her. Now it seemed the only way to truly understand her, and perhaps finally to understand myself in relation to her, was to step into the very shadow she had so carefully, so completely concealed. The lacquered box was no longer just a collection of cryptic objects. It was an invitation. And despite everything, I found I couldn't refuse. The days following my meeting with Dr. Hayes took on a peculiar rhythm. My mornings, once dictated by Mother's medication schedule or the demands of a manuscript, were now spent in the hushed aisles of the university library's East Asian collection, a section I'd never had cause to visit, a continent away from Mother's beloved European romantics. I, Sarah Miller, who once prided herself on knowing the precise publication date of every Virginia Woolf novel, was now squinting at primers on Chinese calligraphy and trying to differentiate between Mandarin and Cantonese phonetics. It was, to put it mildly, disorienting. Dr. Hayes had been generous with a reading list, and I devoured books on Chinese history, art, and philosophy, searching for context, for any breadcrumb that might lead me closer to understanding Lynn and the sorrow of those 1,000 uncrossed miles. The lacquered box sat on my desk at home, the stones arranged in the order Dr. Hayes had suggested, like silent, accusing witnesses to a life I was only now beginning to glimpse. A disciplined mind seeks clarity, Sarah, not clutter. Mother's voice echoed as I tried to make sense of the flowing, abstract beauty of ancient poetry. Clutter. That's what she would have called this dive into a world so far removed from her meticulously curated intellectual salon. Or was it? The more I read, the more I saw echoes of her own fierce intellect, her appreciation for precision, her almost ruthless dedication to her chosen field. Was this hidden passion for Eastern art a rebellion? A secret garden cultivated away from the judgmental eyes of her academic peers, or perhaps even from herself? One afternoon, while finally tackling the daunting task of sorting Mother's overflowing wardrobe, Mark had conveniently declared himself allergic to mothballs and decades of accumulated tweed. I found it. Tucked into the pocket of an old, rarely worn gardening smock was a small folded piece of paper. Not rice paper this time, but a faded receipt from a local nursery, dated almost 30 years ago. On the back, in Mother's unmistakable script, was a single line. Plum blossom sapling for Lynn's garden. Lynn's garden. Here. In this very town? My heart hammered. A plum blossom. The scent of plum blossoms in a courtyard I will never see again. But this receipt suggested a courtyard, a garden much closer to home. Had Lynn lived here? Or had Mother planted it for him? A living memorial to a love lost across those uncrossed miles? The nursery was still in business, an anachronistic little place on the outskirts of town I'd driven past 1,000 times without a second glance. My phone buzzed. Mark. This time I answered, a strange calmness settling over me as I looked at the faded receipt. Sarah? Just checking in. Henderson sent over the preliminary quitclaim deeds for the house. You need to sign them before a notary. I can courier them over. His voice was all business, brisk, efficient. He was already moving on, monetizing his inheritance, while I was unearthing ghosts. Mark, I said, my gaze still on Mother's handwriting. Did Mother ever have a plum tree? Or talk about someone in town with a significant, Asian-style garden? A pause. Then his familiar, slightly impatient sigh. A plum tree? Sarah, are we really going to inventory the flora and fauna now? There are probate deadlines, you know. Can we focus on the actual property? The property is yours, Mark. I reminded him, a new edge in my voice. My focus, it seems, is on understanding the woman who gave it to you. I ignored his sputtering. The nursery receipt. Do you remember her ever buying a plum sapling? Around 1993. Another sigh, louder this time. Sarah, I have no earthly idea what trees Mother bought 30 years ago. I was probably, I don't know, closing my first merger or something equally insignificant to your current horticultural investigation. Sarcasm dripped from his voice. Right, I said, a sudden fierce determination solidifying. Mergers. Of course. I hung up before he could launch into another lecture on fiscal responsibility. The plum sapling. Lockwood and Finch. The painted stones. Lynn. Mother's life wasn't a straightforward narrative to be neatly filed away. It was a garden of forking paths, and I had just found a new unexpected gate. And unlike Mark, I was damn well going to see where it led. Miller's family nursery and garden supplies hadn't changed much in 30 years, judging by the faded paint on its folksy sign and the pleasantly chaotic jumble of terracotta pots, bags of soil, and gardening gnomes that greeted me. It was the kind of place Mother, with her highbrow disdain for anything overtly twee, would have normally avoided like a poorly punctuated sonnet, which made her alleged purchase of a plum sapling here all the more intriguing. An elderly man with earth deeply ingrained in the lines of his hands and a faded baseball cap perched on his white hair looked up from repotting a rosebush as I approached. He had the unhurried air of someone who measured time in seasons, not seconds. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "Possibly," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for some information about a purchase made here a long time ago. Around 1993. A plum blossom sapling." I held out the faded receipt, now encased in a protective plastic sleeve I'd unearthed from Mother's desk. An archivist's habit, it seemed, was contagious. He took the receipt, squinting at it through spectacles perched on the end of his nose. 93. That's a ways back. He rubbed his chin. Plum blossoms. Don't sell a terrible lot of those. Most folks round here want maples for shade or something that'll give 'em fruit they can actually eat, not just look at. He gave me a shrewd glance. This for sentimental reasons, then? You could say that, I admitted. It was bought by an Eleanor Miller. Would you happen to remember her? Or keep records that far back? He scratched his head. Eleanor Miller. Name rings a bell. Stern sort of lady, wasn't she? Always asking about the Latin names for things like she was testing you. He chuckled. I remember her now. She did buy a plum sapling. A Mume plum, the weeping variety. Special order it was. Not many folks asked for that specific one. Said she wanted it for a memorial garden she was planning. For a friend, she said. Someone far away. A memorial garden. For Lynn. Here. My breath caught. Did she say where this garden was? Or who the friend was? He shook his head. Nah, miss. Didn't pry. Just sold her the tree and some good soil. She was very particular about the soil. He paused. Then his eyes lit up with a flicker of recollection. But I do remember one thing. She asked for directions to the old Quaker cemetery. Said she needed a quiet place, somewhere undisturbed. For reflection, I suppose. The old Quaker cemetery. It was on the other side of town, a small historic plot I'd only ever vaguely known existed, surrounded by ancient oaks rarely visited. A place of profound, undisturbed quiet. The perfect place for a secret garden. A hidden memorial. Thanking the man, I left the nursery, my mind racing. Mother, the stoic intellectual, planting a tree in a forgotten cemetery for a lost love from a hidden past? It was a narrative so far removed from the Eleanor I knew. It felt like reading a poorly translated novel. And yet, the pieces were beginning to fit, forming a picture that was both heartbreaking and strangely beautiful. The painted stones, the unsent letters, the plum blossom. They weren't random affectations. They were a language. A language of grief, of remembrance, of a love that had, against all odds, endured. I wondered briefly what Mark would make of this. Probably declare it all highly impractical, and suggest the cemetery land be rezoned for luxury condos. The thought, which once might have made me angry, now just felt distant. His world of mergers and market shares felt a million miles away from this quiet, aching landscape of my mother's secret heart. The Quaker cemetery. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I had to go there. Whatever answers or further questions awaited me among those old headstones and whispering oaks, I had to find them. The lacquered box on my passenger seat suddenly felt less like a burden and more like a compass, pointing the way to a woman I was only just beginning to meet. The old Quaker cemetery wasn't on any tourist map of Miller's Crossing. It lay at the end of a narrow, unpaved lane, a forgotten acre shielded by a grove of ancient, gnarled oaks that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. There was no ornate gate, just a low stone wall, moss-covered and crumbling in places. It felt less like a graveyard and more like a piece of land that time, and the bustling world beyond the oaks, had politely agreed to overlook. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. Something faintly, elusively sweet. I walked slowly among the simple, weathered headstones, most dating back to the 18th and 19th centuries. The names were faded, the epitaphs brief and unadorned, reflecting the Quakers' valuation of simplicity and inner light. There were no grand mausoleums, no weeping angels, just rows of humble stones tilted at various angles, as if bowing to the weight of years. If Mother had indeed created a memorial garden here, it would have to be discreet, unobtrusive, very Eleanor Miller in its own contrarian way. I could almost hear her voice, critiquing the uneven spacing of the headstones, the regrettable lack of aesthetic cohesion. And yet there was a profound peace here, a stillness that settled deep in my bones, a counterpoint to the turmoil that had been my constant companion for weeks. Perhaps this was what drew her here. A place where the relentless pursuit of intellectual perfection could finally rest, where only the elemental truths of existence remained. I searched for nearly an hour, my hope beginning to fray. Perhaps the nursery owner had been mistaken. Perhaps Mother had only considered this place. Then, tucked away in a far corner, almost hidden by an overgrown rhododendron bush, I saw it. Not a garden in the traditional sense, no neat flower beds or manicured paths. But there, beneath a younger, more slender oak than its ancient brethren, was a single weeping mullein plum tree. Its branches, bare in the late autumn chill, were delicate and gracefully arched, like calligraphy strokes against the gray sky. And around its base, almost invisible beneath a scattering of fallen oak leaves, was a ring of smooth gray stones, not randomly placed, arranged, like the ones in the lacquered box. My heart constricted. I knelt, brushing away the leaves. There were perhaps a dozen stones, each one different, each one bearing a single faded black character. I recognized Shou and Fu from Dr. Hayes's explanation. Others were new, their meanings a mystery. But their presence here, beneath this specific tree, in this forgotten place, was an undeniable testament. This was Lin's garden, or Mother's memorial to him. I sat on the damp earth, the scent of plum blossoms, or perhaps just the phantom memory of them, clinging to the air. So this was it. This was the hidden sanctuary of Eleanor Miller's heart. Not a grand gesture, not a public display, but a quiet, secret conversation with a grief she had carried for what must have been decades. The woman who had demanded intellectual rigor from the world, who had dissected emotions with such clinical precision, had, in this secluded corner, allowed her own heart to speak in a language of stones and a solitary weeping tree. The anger over the will, the sting of being overlooked, felt different now. Not gone, but somehow recontextualized. Placed against this backdrop of profound, lifelong, hidden sorrow, my own grievances felt smaller, more manageable. What if Mother's decision about the house, about Mark, hadn't been about me at all? What if it had been about protecting this fragile secret legacy? Or ensuring that someone, perhaps someone with Mark's practical financial acumen, as she might have seen it, could ensure this quiet corner remained undisturbed? The thought was unsettling, a rearranging of all my established narratives. My fingers traced the bark of the young plum tree. Tucked into a crevice, almost hidden by moss, was something small and metallic. I eased it out. A tiny, tarnished silver locket, no bigger than my thumbnail. It was clasped shut. A locket. Here. For whom? And what secret did it hold? Nestled against the heartwood of a tree planted for a lost love. The layers of Eleanor Miller, it seemed, were infinite. And I, her daughter, was only just beginning to peel them back. The tarnished silver locket lay heavy in my palm, cool against my skin despite the faint warmth of the late autumn sun filtering through the oaks. It was tiny, intricately chased with a design too worn to decipher clearly, but it felt ancient, imbued with a history that resonated far beyond its small size. The clasp was stubborn, as if reluctant to yield its secrets after so many years of silent vigil against the plum tree's bark. With a determined fingernail, I finally coaxed it open. Inside, there were no miniature portraits, no lock of hair as Victorian sentiment might dictate. Instead, pressed behind a tiny yellowed piece of protective celluloid, was a minuscule, impossibly delicate, dried plum blossom. And on the other side, even tinier, was a single, exquisitely painted Chinese character. Lin, Forest. Or a common surname, Lin, the recipient of Mother's unsent letters. The inspiration for her secret garden. A wave of emotion so potent it almost buckled my knees washed over me. This wasn't just an academic puzzle anymore. Not just a series of interesting historical or linguistic clues. This was real. This was a love so profound, so enduring, that Mother had carried its emblem hidden in a forgotten cemetery, perhaps visiting it secretly for decades, tending a tree that was a living testament to a heart I never knew she possessed. The formidable scholar, the scourge of sloppy syntax, had loved someone with this quiet, heartbreaking intensity. All those years of her criticisms, her emotional distance, her relentless focus on intellectual achievement, had they been a shield? A way to protect this vulnerable secret core from a world that had, perhaps, already dealt it a devastating blow? The 1,000 uncrossed miles, Dr. Hayes had translated, took on a new, sharper meaning. This wasn't just geographical distance. It was the distance of loss, of a life unlived together. The locket, with its single blossom and its silent name, went into my pocket, a tangible weight against my thigh as I drove home. The meeting with Mark was scheduled for that afternoon. A shift from the morning, a concession he'd made due to a sudden unavoidable client brunch. I suspected the real reason was to give me less time to brood, as he'd once put it. Little did he know my brooding had now acquired an entirely new and far more compelling subject. He was already in the study when I arrived back, surrounded by more boxes, a look of brisk, slightly impatient efficiency on his face. He'd even started labeling some. Eleanor Miller published works. Eleanor Miller correspondence. Academic. He was, in his own way, curating her public legacy, the one the world knew. Find anything interesting at the plant store? He asked, the sarcasm back in place, though a little muted. I didn't answer his jibe directly. Instead, I placed the lacquer box on the desk between us. I found Mother's memorial to Lynn, I said quietly. Mark frowned. Lynn? Who's Lynn? Another obscure poet. Possibly, I said, watching his face carefully. Or possibly the reason Mother's will was structured by Lockwood and Finch, and not by Mr. Henderson. The reason she might have been protecting assets. The reason for a lifetime of secrets. He stared at the box, then at me, his usual confidence wavering. Sarah, what are you talking about? Protecting assets from whom? For what? For the first time there was a note of genuine unease in his voice, not just annoyance. That, I said, picking up one of the painted stones, Unsung, is what I'm beginning to find out. I didn't tell him about the locket. That felt too personal, too raw. Not yet. But it seems Mother's legacy is a good deal more complicated than just this house and a few first editions, Mark. And her reasons for everything, including how she chose to divide her tangible assets, might be far more complex than simple favoritism or a sudden attack of senility. I looked around the room at the boxes he'd so neatly labeled. Before you call Henderson about those quitclaim deeds, I said, my voice calm but firm, I think we both need to understand what or who Eleanor Miller was truly trying to protect. Or provide for. Don't you? He didn't answer immediately, just stared at the lacquered box as if it might suddenly reveal all its secrets. The confident set of his jaw had softened, replaced by a look I hadn't seen on him since we were children and he'd broken Mother's favorite vase. A look of dawning, uncomfortable realization that he might be profoundly out of his depth. And in that moment I knew this wasn't just my quest anymore. Whether he wanted to or not, Mark was about to become acquainted with the ghost of Lynn too. The air in Mother's study, a room that had witnessed countless silent battles of will between her and me, and more recently between Mark and me, now crackled with a different kind of energy. Not the sharp static of resentment, but the thrum of a shared unwelcome enigma. Mark, who usually operated with the decisive speed of a corporate raider, looked genuinely adrift. He kept picking up the painted stones, turning them over, as if their smooth surfaces might yield an immediate, quantifiable answer. So, he said finally, breaking a long silence, his voice stripped of its usual assurance. Lynn. Person presumably. Not another of Mother's obscure literary allusions. Presumably, I agreed, resisting the urge to point out that his previous dismissals were looking rather foolish now. Dr. Hayes at the university is attempting to translate the letter. She believes it's a series of entries addressed to this Lynn, and that the stones are significant symbols, possibly related to blessings, or a memorial. Mark ran a hand through his hair, the gesture less about style now and more about genuine perturbation. A memorial? In the Quaker cemetery? Mother hated anything she considered maudlin sentimentality. This doesn't track, Sarah. None of it does. Perhaps the Eleanor Miller we knew wasn't the only Eleanor Miller there was, I suggested, my voice softer than I'd intended. For a moment, looking at his bewildered face, he wasn't my slick, successful, favored younger brother. He was just another person trying to make sense of a mother who had always been more of an intricate puzzle than an open book. He was silent for a moment, then said almost to himself, There was once, years ago, I was home from college for the summer. I found Mother in the garden crying. Actually crying, Sarah. Not her usual exasperated sighs. She was holding a small, wilting flower. A white one. She just said, Some things you never get over. I thought she was being dramatic about a plant dying. He looked at me, a new uncertain light in his eyes. It was a plum blossom, wasn't it? The air left my lungs. A plum blossom. The scent of plum blossoms in a courtyard I will never see again. Mother crying over a wilting flower, mourning a lost love, and her son in his youthful self-absorption had dismissed it as melodrama. The irony was so thick, so Eleanor Miller-esque, I almost wanted to laugh or cry or both. "Yes, Mark," I said quietly. "I think it was." He paced the small study, no longer the confident executive, but a man grappling with a truth that threatened to rewrite his entire understanding of his mother. "So this, Lynn, this was serious." "It appears so." "And Lockwood and Finch, the will?" He stopped, looking directly at me. "Do you think, is it possible this whole convoluted legal mess has something to do with him? With protecting something for? Or from this, Lynn?" "It's what Professor Finch hinted at," I said. "That mother's actions, however inequitable they seem to us, might have had a logic rooted in this hidden part of her life. A logic we can't understand until we understand Lynn." He was silent again, then nodded, a decisive movement. "Right. Okay. So Dr. Hayes, when will she have more? And what else can we do? There must be records. Mother kept everything, even if it was in her own eccentric system." It was the first time Mark had ever asked for my lead on anything that didn't involve locating a misplaced tax return. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Dr. Hayes needs time," I said. "But in the meantime, you said Mother was obsessed with how history would remember her, with her literary legacy going to the right archives. Maybe the clues aren't just in what she wrote to Lynn, but in what she wrote about her own work, her own life for those archives. Did she ever compile a catalogue raisonné? Detailed notes for a biographer?" Mark's eyes lit up. "The university archives. She donated reams of papers to them a few years before Dad died. Said it was to reduce clutter, but she was always a bit theatrical about it. I never paid much attention. It was all just dusty academic stuff. Dusty academic stuff. Or perhaps, I thought, the Rosetta Stone to Eleanor Miller's heart. Then perhaps, Mark," I said, a small, almost genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "It's time we both developed an appreciation for dusty academic stuff. Shall we? After all, it's part of our shared inheritance now, isn't it?" The unspoken challenge hung in the air. Could they work together? Even for this? The university archive was exactly as Mark had described it. Dusty, filled with the faint dry scent of decaying paper, and organized with a logic that seemed to belong to a previous century. Row upon row of gray, anonymous boxes lined metal shelves, each one a silent repository of some academic's life's work. It felt like a mausoleum for forgotten ideas. And somewhere in here, possibly, lay the key to Eleanor Miller's secret heart. Mother has 12 boxes listed under Miller E. Collected papers and correspondence, Mark announced, consulting a printout with an air of someone tackling a particularly tedious due diligence report. "They're in section 7, aisles D through F. Let's be methodical. You take D, I'll take E, we meet at F." He was already pulling a cart, all business. I suppressed a sigh. Even in pursuit of a deeply personal family mystery, Mark defaulted to project management. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of trepidation and reverence. These weren't just collected papers. They were the unfiltered thoughts, the intellectual DNA of a woman who had been, for better or worse, the central pillar of my existence. We worked in a silence broken only by the rustle of brittle paper, and the occasional sneeze from Mark as dust motes danced in the dim fluorescent light. He was, true to his word, methodical, flipping through folders with a detached efficiency, occasionally muttering, "Lecture notes, 1978 correspondence with some obscure German philosopher, more lecture notes." He was looking for a smoking gun, a clear labeled folder titled My Secret Life with Lynn. I, however, found myself drawn to the margins. To the doodles in the corners of draft manuscripts, the press flowers tucked between pages of student essays, the shopping lists scribbled on the backs of grant applications. Mother's public persona was all about intellectual rigor, but here in these unguarded spaces were glimpses of something else. A wistful sketch of a weeping willow. A quote from a love poem, not Shakespeare but Li Qingzhao, a female Song Dynasty poet Dr. Hayes had mentioned. Then in a box simply labeled, Miscellaneous for 1970, I found it. Not a letter, not a diary, but a small leather-bound sketchbook. The pages were filled with delicate, surprisingly skilled ink drawings. Landscapes mostly, but not the familiar New England countryside. These were different. Pagodas nestled among misty mountains, intricate bridges arching over still waters, and on several pages studies of a single subject, plum blossoms. Dozens of them in various stages of bloom, rendered with an almost devotional intensity. And on the very last page, a single exquisite drawing of a man's face. Asian features, high cheekbones, eyes that seem to hold a profound, gentle sadness. Beneath it, almost invisible, two tiny characters, lean, and next to it, a stylized plum blossom. My breath caught in my throat. Lynn. This was him. This was the face that had launched 1,000 uncrossed miles of sorrow. The inspiration for a secret garden in a forgotten cemetery. He was young in the drawing, perhaps in his late 20s, the age Mother would have been before Dad. The artistry was undeniable, but more than that, there was a tenderness in the lines, a palpable affection that made my own eyes sting. This was not the work of a casual acquaintance. Find anything besides Mother's grocery lists? Mark called from the next aisle, his voice muffled by shelves of dissertations. I couldn't speak for a moment. I carefully closed the sketchbook, the image of Lynn's face seared into my mind. This felt sacred, too intimate to share with Mark's pragmatic scrutiny just yet. Just more of her academic life, I managed, my voice a little shaky, but I knew I'd found something crucial. This wasn't just about a name anymore, or a few cryptic stones. This was a face. A love. A story that was rapidly eclipsing the sterile legalities of Lockwood and Finch, and the petty squabbles over a house. We packed up a few boxes Mark deemed potentially relevant to estate settlement, mostly old tax documents and property deeds he hadn't seen before. He seemed oblivious to the tremor in my hands as I carried the box containing the sketchbook. He was already talking about meeting with Henderson again, about expediting the probate process. As we left the archive, Mark was already on his phone, presumably to his own lawyer, discussing strategy. I walked beside him, the small sketchbook clutched protectively in my bag. He was focused on the will, on the assets, on the fundamentals. I was focused on a face sketched with love and loss, on a story whispered in ink and plum blossoms. We were in the same family, dealing with the same inheritance, but it was becoming increasingly clear we were searching for entirely different kinds of truth. And mine, I suspected, was buried far deeper. The small leather-bound sketchbook never left my side for the rest of that weekend. It sat on my nightstand as I slept, its pages whispering of plum blossoms and a love that defied borders. I studied Lynn's face, the gentle curve of his eyes, the quiet strength in his jaw, searching for a clue, a resonance, something that would explain the chasm between the mother I knew and the woman who had drawn this man with such evident tenderness. My own grief over Mother felt recalibrated, tinged now with a profound curiosity and an unexpected ache for a sorrow that wasn't mine, yet somehow felt deeply connected to my own. Monday morning found me back in Dr. Hayes's office, the sketchbook open on her desk. Her reaction was quieter than mine had been, but no less profound. She examined the drawings with the meticulous care of a curator handling a priceless artifact. "The skill is remarkable," she murmured, tracing a plum blossom with a delicate fingertip. "This isn't a casual hobby, Sarah. This is the work of someone with significant training, or at the very least, a profound natural talent that was deeply nurtured." She paused at Lynn's portrait. "And this is drawn from life or from a very vivid memory. There's an immediacy to it, an emotional truth." "Mother never drew," I said, the words feeling hollow even to me. "Not like this. She'd critique art, dissect it, but create it? She always said she lacked the temperament for sustained artistic folly." Another of her pronouncements designed, I now suspected, to deflect, to hide. Dr. Hayes smiled gently. Perhaps her definition of folly was different when she was younger. Or perhaps this talent was a private sanctuary, like her plum garden. People contain multitudes, Sarah. Especially women of Eleanor's generation, who often had to compartmentalize their passions. She looked at the characters beneath Lynn's portrait. The plum blossom next to Lynn. In some traditions, it symbolizes resilience, perseverance, beauty blooming in adversity. It's a very potent symbol, often associated with scholars, poets, and those who endure hardship with grace. She tapped the sketchbook. Given the age of this paper and the style, if this Lin was Chinese, and if Eleanor knew him before she met your father, we might be looking at a period in the mid to late 1960s, perhaps early 70s. A tumultuous time, politically and culturally, in both our countries, and certainly for any cross-cultural connections. The unspoken implication hung in the air. War, Cold War tensions, immigration difficulties. Obstacles that could indeed create 1,000 uncrossed miles. The weight of this hidden history felt immense, and the impending sorting out session with Mark, ostensibly about probate and property deeds, now seemed almost farcical. How could we divide Mother's material possessions when we didn't even understand the geography of her heart? Mark, true to his promise, arrived that afternoon, armed with more boxes and an air of grim determination. He seemed to have processed his initial shock at the lacquered box and reverted to his default setting. Efficient, slightly impatient problem solver. Right, he said, rubbing his hands together. Let's get this study cleared. Henderson says the sooner we itemize, the smoother the probate. Less chance of complications. He avoided my gaze, his focus entirely on the task at hand. I watched him for a moment. The man who stood to inherit the house, the business assets, the tangible bulk of Eleanor Miller's life. Did he feel nothing of the earthquake that had just laid beneath our feet? Or was his pragmatism simply a more effective shield than my raw, unfolding confusion? Mark, I began as he started pulling books from a high shelf, creating a cloud of dust. When you were younger, did Mother ever talk about her own youth? Before she met Dad? Did she ever mention studying art? Or having friends from different backgrounds? He paused, a dusty copy of Plato in his hand. Art? Mother. Sarah, her idea of artistic expression was correcting the grammar on a restaurant menu. And friends from different backgrounds? Her circle was academics mostly. You know that. Why all these historical detours? Can't we just focus on what needs to be done now? His impatience was palpable. I looked at his face, at the genuine incomprehension there, or perhaps the very effective pretense of it, and I made a decision. He wasn't ready for Lynn. He wasn't ready for the plum blossoms, or the painted stones, or the sorrow of 1,000 uncrossed miles. Sharing it with him now would be like reading Keats to a stockbroker. A fruitless, frustrating exercise. This part of Mother's story for now was mine alone to uncover. You're right, Mark, I said, my voice surprisingly calm, almost gentle. Let's focus on the boxes. But as I turned to a dusty shelf, the image of Lynn's face from the sketchbook, so full of quiet sorrow and unspoken love, was more vivid, more real to me than all the first editions and property deeds in that room combined. The will had divided her assets, but her heart, I was beginning to suspect, had been bequeathed elsewhere long ago, in a currency Mark would never understand, and I was only just beginning to learn. The following week was a strange dichotomy. By day, I performed the role of the dutiful, if somewhat detached, daughter, boxing up Mother's tangible life under Mark's impatient supervision. We filled endless containers with her clothes, mostly tweed as he'd predicted, destined for a charity shop that probably specialized in outfitting retired academics, her kitchenware, chipped, mismatched but functional, a testament to her prioritizing books over bone china, and her endless books. Mark, bless his laser-focused, unsentimental heart, was a whirlwind of efficiency, eager to list the house and liquidate what he termed the Eleanor Miller collection. By night, however, after Mark had retreated to his sterile downtown hotel room, I became a different kind of archivist. Armed with the sketchbook, Dr. Hayes's notes, and a growing pile of books on Chinese art and history, I delved into Mother's secret world. The plum blossoms in her drawings were rendered with a specific technique Dr. Hayes had identified as characteristic of a certain mid-century Shanghai school of artists. The landscapes, too, while stylized, hinted at specific geographical features, misty mountains, terraced rice paddies that were decidedly not New England. A disciplined mind seeks clarity, Sarah, not clutter. Mother's voice echoed as I tried to make sense of the flowing, abstract beauty of ancient poetry. Clutter. That's what she would have called this dive into a world so far removed from her meticulously curated intellectual salon. Or was it? The more I read, the more I saw echoes of her own fierce intellect, her appreciation for precision, her almost ruthless dedication to her chosen field. Was this hidden passion for Eastern art a rebellion? A secret garden cultivated away from the judgmental eyes of her academic peers, or perhaps even from herself? One evening, while cross-referencing dates from Mother's academic CV with periods of known artistic exchange between the US and China, a long shot, I knew, but Dr. Hayes had suggested it, I found a footnote in an obscure art journal. It mentioned a visiting scholar program in the late 1960s, a brief post-cultural revolution thaw that allowed a handful of Chinese artists and academics to study in the West. The hosting university, the very one where Mother had been a young, ambitious doctoral candidate. My breath caught. It was tenuous, a thread so fine it might snap with the slightest pressure. But it was something. The next day, as Mark was wrestling a particularly heavy box of Mother's sociological treatises into the hallway, he grumbled, "Honestly, who keeps this much paper? It's like she never threw anything away." "Some people find value in preserving history, Mark," I said, looking up from a delicate ink drawing of bamboo I'd found tucked inside a copy of the Analects. "Even the parts that aren't immediately profitable." He shot me a suspicious look. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, meeting his gaze with a newfound steadiness I didn't quite feel, "that Mother was a complex woman. More complex than either of us gave her credit for." I paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Did she ever mention any visiting scholars? From her doctoral days? Perhaps someone with an interest in Eastern art." He snorted. "Visiting scholars? Sarah, she barely tolerated her own colleagues. The idea of her mentoring some wide-eyed exchange student in Eastern art is, frankly, laughable." He hefted another box. "Let's stick to the task at hand, shall we? The appraiser is coming on Friday." His dismissal, so typical, so absolute, no longer stung as it once might have. It simply confirmed that whatever answers I was going to find, I would likely find them alone. Or with the help of women like Dr. Hayes, women who understood the subtle languages of art, history, and the hidden lives of other women. That evening, I made another call to Dr. Hayes, outlining my new, albeit fragile, theory. Her excitement was palpable. "The visiting scholar program, yes, that's a distinct possibility, Sarah. The university archives from that period might hold student rosters, faculty exchange records. It would be a needle in a haystack, but it's a haystack worth searching," I finished for her. "The appraiser could wait. The boxes could wait. Even Mark and his quitclaim deeds could wait." Tomorrow I was going back to the university. Not as Eleanor Miller's uninspired but good daughter, sifting through the remnants of a life, but as Sarah Miller, researcher, detective, on the trail of a ghost named Lynn, and the woman who had loved him enough to create a secret world of plum blossoms and painted stones. The university archive on my second visit felt different. Less like a mausoleum and more like a hushed, expectant library waiting for the right reader to unlock its stories. Armed with Dr. Hayes' suggestion about the visiting scholar program and the potential timeframe of the late 1960s, I bypassed Mother's neatly catalogued published works and headed straight for the administrative records of the arts and humanities faculty from that era. It was, as Dr. Hayes had warned, a needle in a haystack operation. Decades of departmental minutes, student exchange agreements, faculty memos, all typed on flimsy onion skin paper or mimeographed to near illegibility. Hours passed. My back ached. My eyes burned from deciphering faded type. The air conditioning hummed a monotonous dirge. Mark would have lasted precisely 10 minutes in this environment before declaring it an utter waste of billable hours. But for me, each dusty folder, each brittle page held a faint, tantalizing promise. I was sifting through the official pronouncements of academia, hoping to find a whisper of Mother's unofficial heart. It was in a box labeled Faculty Exchange Correspondence, 1968 to 1970, that I found the first tremor. Most of the letters were dry, formal exchanges between department heads and international universities regarding visas, stipends, and course loads. Then a single handwritten note on thicker, almost creamy paper caught my eye. It was from the then Dean of Humanities to a Professor Chan at a university in Beijing, expressing regret that a Mr. Lin Bai, a promising young calligrapher and poet, who had been accepted into a short-term visiting artist program, had his travel unexpectedly and indefinitely postponed by his home authorities due to unforeseen political shifts. Lin Bai, The name resonated like a struck gong. My fingers trembled as I read on. The dean expressed hope that Mr. Lin might be able to join them in a future semester. There were no further letters from Professor Chan, or any mention of Lin Bai in subsequent files. Indefinitely postponed. A bureaucratic euphemism for a door slammed shut. A future erased. I thought of Mother's sketchbook, filled with plum blossoms. A symbol of resilience in the face of adversity, Dr. Hayes had said. The delicate, sorrowful face of Lin. The unsent letters speaking of 1,000 uncrossed miles, and a promise broken by circumstance, not by heart. The unforeseen political shifts of late 1960s China. The Cultural Revolution. An era of upheaval, of severed connections, of lives irrevocably altered. My heart was pounding now. I went back to Mother's own donated boxes, pulling out one labeled Early Career Grant Applications and Unpublished Manuscripts. I sifted through drafts of her doctoral thesis, early lecture notes. And then I found it. Tucked inside a folder of rejection letters for her first poetry collection, a collection Alastair Finch had told me she'd been fiercely proud of, despite its lack of publication, was a small, official-looking document. It was a university ID card slightly faded from 1969. It bore the name Eleanor Vance, her maiden name, and her stern, youthful photograph. And stapled carefully to the back, almost hidden, was a tiny black-and-white passport-sized photo of a young Asian man. Lin Bai. The same gentle, sorrowful eyes from her sketchbook. He was real. He had been here or was meant to be here. And Mother, young, ambitious, fiercely intellectual Eleanor Vance, had loved him. Loved him enough to keep his photograph hidden against her own for over 50 years. Loved him enough, perhaps, to build a secret garden of stones and a weeping plum tree in a forgotten cemetery. Loved him enough to what? Structure her entire life, her will, around this monumental hidden grief? The formidable scholar, the critic of excessive sentimentality, had carried a love story worthy of the tragic poets she studied, locked away in the deepest archive of her heart. The sheer, breathtaking extent of her secrecy, her lifelong private mourning, was overwhelming. I carefully placed Lin Bai's photograph back with Mother's ID. The puzzle pieces were no longer just scattered. They were beginning to form a coherent, devastating, and profoundly human picture. The question now, the one that burned with an almost unbearable intensity, was how this secret love, this lost future, connected to the will that had disinherited me and favored Mark. And what, if anything, could I, or should I do about it? The drive back to Mother's house, Mark's house, I corrected myself again, though the term felt increasingly hollow, was a blur. Lin Bai's face, young, earnest, sorrowful, was superimposed over the familiar suburban streets. The meticulously kept lawns, the sensible sedans in the driveways, all seemed part of a different, far less interesting reality than the one I had just unearthed in the dusty archives. Mother's world, it turned out, had contained continents of emotion I'd never even known existed on her map. The thought of facing Mark again, of continuing the charade of sorting through assets, while this monumental secret about Mother's heart lay hidden in my bag, was almost unbearable. Part of me wanted to thrust the sketchbook, the ID card with Lin's photo, under his nose and demand, "Did you know? Did you have any idea who she truly was, beyond the balance sheets and the property deeds?" But another, more cautious part, the part that had learned to navigate Eleanor Miller's complex currents for a lifetime, held me back. This discovery felt too new, too fragile, too profoundly personal to expose to Mark's blunt pragmatism just yet. He would likely see it as another historical detour, a distraction from the task at hand. And perhaps a small selfish part of me wanted to keep this version of Mother, the passionate, loving, heartbroken young woman, to myself for a little longer, before the lawyers and the inevitable family postmortems picked it apart. When Mark arrived later that afternoon, full of his usual restless energy, I had composed myself. The sketchbook and the ID card were safely tucked away. We resumed the task of emptying Mother's bedroom closet, a space that now felt like an archaeological site ripe with potential artifacts of her secret life. "Find any more national treasures?" Mark asked, his voice laced with the familiar light sarcasm, though he did glance curiously at the small, intense frown of concentration I probably wore. "Just the usual collection of mothballed wool and sensible shoes, Mark," I replied, pulling out a paisley silk scarf I'd never seen her wear. It smelled faintly of sandalwood like Dr. Hayes's office. Another small, sharp pang. Though one does wonder what stories these sensible shoes could tell, if they could talk. Where they walked. Who they walked with. He rolled his eyes. Sarah, their shoes. They walked to the grocer's and occasionally to a faculty tea. Let's not get overly poetic about Mother's footwear. Perhaps not. But as I cleared out the bottom drawer of her vanity, a place filled with old, dried-up lipstick tubes and sample-sized perfume bottles, my fingers brushed against something hard and flat, hidden beneath a layer of faded silk handkerchiefs. It was a thin, lacquered wooden box, smaller than the one from her bedside, this one inlaid with mother-of-pearl cranes. And inside were a dozen or more letters, tied with a faded red ribbon. The envelopes were addressed to Miss Eleanor Vance, at her old university dormitory address. The stamps were American, but the return address on each one was simply Lin Bai, followed by a series of Chinese characters and, crucially, a postmark from San Francisco, California, dated between 1968 and 1970. My heart leaped. These weren't Mother's unsent letters to Lin. These were Lin's letters to Mother, sent from within the United States, during the very period he was supposedly indefinitely postponed by Chinese authorities. Mark, noticing my sudden stillness, the way I clutched the small bundle of letters, came over. What is it now? Found her secret stash of love sonnets from Lord Byron. Without a word, I handed him the top envelope. He took it, glanced at the return address, then frowned. Lin Bai? San Francisco? Who the hell is Lin Bai sending Mother letters from San Francisco in 1969? He looked up at me, genuine confusion, and perhaps a flicker of something else, intrigue? In his eyes, the carefully constructed wall between us, built of years of resentment and misunderstanding, seemed to tremble just for a moment. That, Mark, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, is precisely what I intend to find out, and I have a feeling these letters might just be the Rosetta Stone we've been looking for. The question is, are you ready to start deciphering? The challenge and the invitation hung in the air between us, as fragile and as potent as the dried plum blossom in my pocket. The bundle of letters, tied with that faded red ribbon, lay on Mother's mahogany desk like a sacred offering. For a long moment, neither Mark nor I moved to touch them. The air in the study, already thick with the scent of old paper and unspoken family history, seemed to grow heavier, charged with the anticipation of secrets about to be breached. Mark, who moments before had been all brisk efficiency, now fidgeted with a loose button on his cuff, his gaze fixed on the letters with an uncharacteristic intensity. Well, I said, finally breaking the spell, though my own voice was barely a whisper. Are we going to let them sit there gathering another 30 years of dust? Or are we going to find out who this Lin Bai was to Eleanor Miller? Mark cleared his throat. Right. Yes. Of course. He reached for the bundle, then hesitated, his hand hovering. He looked at me. You should do it, Sarah. You found them. And well, you were the one here. The admission, a rare acknowledgement of my years of care, hung in the air, unexpected and surprisingly poignant. I untied the ribbon, its silk surprisingly supple despite its age. The envelopes were thin, almost translucent. I chose one at random, postmarked San Francisco, March 1969. The handwriting inside was elegant, precise, English surprisingly fluent, but with a faint charming formality. My dearest Yun Cloud. It began. My breath hitched. Yun. Not Eleanor. A secret name for a secret love. The plum blossoms you described in your last letter sound like a memory of home I carry in my own heart. Here in this city of fog and endless hills, I search for their scent in every park, but find only the echoes of what we shared. I read aloud, my voice trembling slightly as Lin's words painted a picture of a young man adrift in a new, bewildering country, sustained by letters from a woman back east, a woman who was clearly his intellectual and emotional anchor. He wrote of his art, his struggles with English idioms, his loneliness, his unwavering hope for their eventual reunion. He mentioned the political climate back in China, the difficult news from home that made his return uncertain. Mark listened in silence, his earlier impatience completely gone, replaced by a look of something I couldn't quite decipher. Not sympathy, not yet. More like a dawning, troubled understanding. He leaned against a bookshelf, arms crossed as if bracing himself. I picked up another letter, dated nearly a year later. Lynn's tone was more somber. The news from your dean is disheartening, my cloud. Indefinitely postponed. Such a sterile phrase for a shattered dream. But you must not grieve for me, or for what might have been. Your own path, your own brilliance, must not be dimmed by this shadow. You have work to do, a voice that must be heard. I release you from any promise, though my heart will never release you. A strangled sound escaped Mark. I looked up. His face was pale. He let her go? It seems so, I said, my own throat tight. Or tried to. So she could pursue her career, her brilliance, without being tethered to a politically complicated future with him. I thought of Mother's relentless drive, her fierce independence, her almost obsessive dedication to her academic work. Had it all been built on the ashes of this renunciation? A life forged in the crucible of a lost love? The image of Eleanor Miller, the formidable matriarch, the unyielding intellectual, began to dissolve, replaced by a younger, more vulnerable woman, a cloud, who had loved deeply and been forced to make an impossible choice. A woman who then perhaps had built walls around her heart so high no one, not even her own children, could fully scale them. Mark pushed himself off the bookshelf, walking over to the window, much as he had the day before. She always pushed me so hard, he said, his voice rough. To succeed. To be financially secure. To not make foolish, romantic choices. I always thought it was because she was ambitious for me, or disappointed in Dad's quiet academic life. He turned, his eyes meeting mine, raw and unguarded for the first time. Maybe she was just trying to protect me from what happened to him. To Lynn. The room was silent again, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of resentment or misunderstanding, but the stunned, aching silence of a shared, devastating revelation. The will, the house, Lockwood and Finch. It all seemed to fade into insignificance. We had stumbled into the heart of Eleanor Miller's oldest, deepest wound. And in doing so perhaps we had just found the first fragile thread that might one day lead to understanding not just her but each other. The study felt different after Lynn Bai's words had filled it. The scent of dust and old paper seemed less like decay and more like the fragrance of a hidden history finally breathing. Mark, for once, was utterly silent, slumped in Mother's armchair, the very picture of a man whose well-ordered world had been tilted on its axis. He wasn't looking at the boxes anymore, or the books. He was looking at the small pile of letters on the desk as if they were live embers. So, I said, my voice gentle, the earlier sarcasm completely absent. It felt wrong somehow to be sharp in the presence of such profound lifelong grief. Our mother. The romantic poet. Mark managed a shaky laugh, a sound utterly unlike his usual confident bark. Who knew? All those years, all those lectures on fiscal responsibility and sensible choices, and all along she was carrying this. He gestured towards the letters. It's like finding out the Sphinx had a secret penchant for silly love songs. It explains a lot, though, doesn't it? I mused, thinking of Mother's almost pathological need for control, her emotional guardedness, her fierce, sometimes suffocating independence, her fear of vulnerability, her insistence on self-reliance. If you'd loved and lost someone so completely, in such impossible circumstances, you'd build walls, Mark finished, his voice barely a whisper. Fort Knox-level walls. He looked at me, a new hesitant understanding in his eyes. And maybe the will, maybe Lockwood and Finch wasn't about favoring me or disinheriting you, Sarah. Maybe it was about protecting something related to him, to Lynn, or to a promise she made to him. The thought coming from Mark was startling. It was one thing for me, the overlooked daughter, to search for a more palatable explanation. It was another entirely for the favored son to suggest his inheritance might be a byproduct of a much larger, older, secret sorrow. Protecting what? I asked. His memory? Some legacy of his she felt responsible for? If he was an artist, a poet, did she try to preserve his work? Is that what the university archives she was so keen on were really about? Mark frowned, tapping his chin. The archives, she did set up a small, anonymous endowment for the East Asian Studies Department a few years back. For the preservation of endangered cultural artifacts and texts. I signed the paperwork as her financial advisor. I thought it was just one of her eccentric academic hobbies. I never connected it to anything personal. He shook his head. God, I've been an idiot. We've both been navigating by a faulty map, Mark, I said, reading only the parts of Mother she allowed us to see. He stood up, walking over to the lacquered box, picking up one of the painted stones. Yuanfen, binding destiny. So what now? He asked, echoing his question from the day before, but this time it held less exasperation and more genuine uncertainty. The house. The will. Lockwood and Finch. Does this change anything? I thought for a moment, Lin-Bai's gentle, sorrowful face from the sketchbook vivid in my mind. The house, which had felt like the ultimate betrayal, now seemed almost secondary. A stage for a much older, much sadder play. I don't know if it legally changes the will, Mark, I said honestly. That's for lawyers to determine, if we even choose to go down that road. But it changes everything else. Changes how I see Mother. It changes what this house might have meant to her. It changes what her legacy truly is. I looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time without the filter of sibling rivalry or perceived injustice. Maybe, I said slowly, before we decide who gets Mother's chipped Wedgwood or her collection of depressing Icelandic poets, we owe it to her, and to Lin-Bai, whoever and wherever he is, or was, to understand their story properly. He met my gaze, his own surprisingly unguarded. The hard lines of the businessman had softened, revealing something younger, more vulnerable. Understand their story, he repeated, as if tasting the words. He looked at the letters, then at the painted stones, then back at me. A long moment passed. Then he gave a single slow nod. Yes, Sarah. I think you're right. I think we do. The unspoken alliance born of shared bewilderment had just found a new, and far more profound purpose. The following days took on the surreal quality of a detective novel co-authored by an estranged brother and sister. The case, of course, was Eleanor Miller herself. Mark, to my surprise, cleared his usually sacrosanct schedule for the remainder of the week. The client emergencies, that had so conveniently punctuated our previous interactions, seemed to have miraculously resolved themselves. Or perhaps for the first time he'd found an emergency that truly captured his attention. Our first port of call, by mutual unspoken agreement, was Dr. Hayes. I had briefed Mark on my initial conversation with her, and he, despite his ingrained skepticism of anything too academic or sentimental, had listened with an uncharacteristic quietness. He'd even asked a few surprisingly insightful questions about the Chinese characters on the stones. Dr. Hayes greeted us in her sandalwood-scented office with a knowing smile that suggested she'd seen her fair share of complex family sagas unfold amongst the footnotes of ancient texts. She listened patiently as Mark, with a surprising lack of his usual business jargon, recounted his own faint memory of Mother crying over a wilting plum blossom. The Mume plum, Dr. Hayes affirmed, nodding. A symbol of resilience, yes, but also of beauty that endures even in winter, often associated with scholars and poets who face adversity. And your mother's mention of a friend far away to the nurseryman, it aligns perfectly with Mr. Lin-Bai's letter speaking of an enforced separation and uncrossed miles. She had made some progress with the letters. The language is beautiful, Sarah, she said, her gaze soft, full of classical allusions, a deep appreciation for nature. Lin-Bai was clearly a man of considerable literary talent himself. He speaks of Eleanor or Yun, his cloud, as his intellectual equal, his soulmate. There are references to shared dreams of a future together, perhaps teaching, writing, a life centered around art and scholarship. But what happened? Mark interjected, his pragmatism resurfacing. Why San Francisco? If he was from China and couldn't return? Dr. Hayes sighed. The late 60s, early 70s, if he was in the U.S. during the height of the Cultural Revolution in China, and if his family or he himself were considered problematic by the regime, return might have been impossible. Or dangerous. San Francisco had, and still has, a significant Chinese émigré community. It would have been a logical, if perhaps lonely place for someone like him to land, cut off from his homeland and, it seems, from your mother. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of a love thwarted by grand, impersonal historical forces. A tragedy far removed from the petty squabbles of Miller's Crossing. Mark was silent, staring at his hands. I wondered if he was thinking of his own easy, unhindered travels, his international business deals, the freedom he'd always taken for granted. Mother's sensible choices regarding her own life, her insistence on financial security, suddenly seemed less about a lack of adventurous spirit and more about the harsh lessons learned from a past where love and dreams could be shattered by the stroke of a political pen. The university archives, I said, breaking the silence. Mother's donated papers. Lin-Bai mentioned her voice that must be heard. Her work. If they were intellectual soulmates, surely there must be some trace of him there, some correspondence, some acknowledgement, however veiled. Mark nodded, a new determination in his eyes. Let's go. Maybe between your intuitive sifting, Sarah, and my ability to read a balance sheet, we might actually figure out what Mother was trying to tell us. Or hide from us. The archive felt less daunting this time, less like a personal penance. Working side by side, Mark and I developed an unexpected rhythm. He, surprisingly, had a knack for deciphering Mother's almost illegible marginalia on financial reports related to her grant funding. I, in turn, could spot a literary allusion or a veiled personal reference in her academic correspondence from a mile away. We were, in our own strange way, beginning to speak Mother's two languages, the language of her public intellect, and the emerging dialect of her secret heart. It was Mark who found it, tucked into a folder labeled, Proposed Symposia Unfunded. A detailed proposal, drafted by Eleanor Miller in the early 1970s, for a cross-cultural symposium on poetics of exile and resilience. Enlisted as a potential keynote speaker, with a brief but glowing biography highlighting his calligraphy and poetry. Mr. Lin-Bai, formerly of Beijing, currently residing in San Francisco. Attached to the proposal was a series of polite but firm rejection letters from various funding bodies. Too niche. Lacks broad appeal. Insufficiently aligned with current departmental priorities. The same dismissals Mother had so often leveled at my own youthful enthusiasms. Mark looked at me, the rejection letters in his hand. She tried, he said, his voice hushed. She really tried to give him a platform to bring his voice here. He paused. And they turned her down. Just like she sometimes turned you down, Sarah. The echo was unmistakable. Mother, thwarted in her attempt to champion the man she loved, had perhaps spent a lifetime ensuring her own legacy, and by extension, the resources to control it would never be dismissed as too niche or lacking appeal. And in doing so, had she unwittingly recreated the very patterns of dismissal that had once wounded another, and then her own daughter? The complexity of it, the tragic human messiness, was almost too much to bear. The will, Lockwood and Finch, the disinheritance, it was all starting to feel less like a betrayal, and more like a heartbreaking, deeply flawed love letter written across time. The drive back from the university archive was quieter than our trip there. The shared revelations about Mother and Lin-Bai had settled between Mark and me like a heavy, intricate tapestry, woven with threads of sorrow, resilience, and a love story neither of us could have imagined. The immediate sting of the will hadn't vanished, but it was now contextualized within a much larger, more profoundly human drama. So Lockwood and Finch, Mark said finally, as we pulled into the driveway of our mother's house. The possessive pronoun felt subtly different now, less a claim of ownership and more an acknowledgement of shared, complicated history. Given all this, what do you think her play was with them? If it wasn't just about straightforward inheritance? I'd been pondering the same question. Professor Finch said they specialize in creative estate planning, asset protection. Dr. Hayes mentioned passages in Lynn's letters where Mother spoke of protecting something or someone. If Mother felt her academic legacy, or perhaps Lynn's artistic legacy through her, was vulnerable, she'd build a financial fortress, Mark finished, a note of grudging admiration in his voice, with legal loopholes big enough to drive a truck through if necessary. And she wouldn't tell anyone, especially not the potential beneficiaries who might have sentimental objections. He shook his head. Damn, she was a piece of work, wasn't she? A masterpiece of complex contradictions. I agreed, a faint smile playing on my lips. The anger was still there, a dull ache, but it was now tempered with a strange, almost proprietary understanding of Eleanor Miller's formidable, infuriating, an ultimately heartbreaking way of operating. So the quitclaim deed for the house. I began, taking a breath. Before all this, Lynn, I was ready to sign it just to be done with it, to wash my hands of the whole mess, even if it felt like surrendering. Mark looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment. And now, this was it, the moment where the past truly intersected with the present. And now, I said slowly, I think we need more information. If Mother set up trusts, if there are other legal structures we don't know about, especially ones managed by Lockwood and Finch, selling the house or dividing assets prematurely might be unwise. It might even go against her deeper, albeit hidden, intentions. He was silent for a long time, staring out at the overgrown rose garden, the plum tree in the distant Quaker cemetery now a vivid image in both our minds, I suspected. What if, he said finally, turning back to me, what if this isn't about you versus me anymore, Sarah? What if it's about us versus Lockwood and Finch? Or at least, us trying to understand what Mother really wanted, before we start dismantling things based on a document that might only be one part of a much larger, more complicated plan. I stared at him. This was a Mark I didn't know. The Mark who usually saw the bottom line above all else, who negotiated for every last percentage point. Now he was suggesting a united front? A quest for understanding that might not directly benefit his inheritance? Are you saying, I asked carefully, you'd be willing to postpone settling the estate? To potentially challenge or at least investigate the full scope of Mother's arrangements with Lockwood and Finch, even if it means a delay in you getting what the will currently states is yours. He ran a hand through his hair, but this time it felt less like agitation and more like genuine perplexity. Look, Sarah, I'm a businessman. I don't like unknowns. And right now, Eleanor Miller's estate feels like one giant damn unknown. If she set up some labyrinthine trust that's going to create legal headaches for years, or if Lockwood and Finch are billing her estate for God knows what. I want to know. We both need to know. He met my gaze. And yes, if understanding what she was really up to with this Lynn person helps clarify that, then I'm in. For now. For now. It wasn't a lifetime commitment, but it was more than I'd expected. A fragile truce then. Not based on sudden familial affection, but on a shared desire to unravel the final, most complex, and perhaps most significant puzzle Eleanor Miller had left behind. The battle for the house had morphed into something else entirely. A joint expedition into the uncharted territory of our mother's secret life, with the formidable law firm of Lockwood and Finch as the gatekeepers. And for the first time, facing Mark didn't feel like facing an adversary. It felt almost like facing an ally. A very reluctant, pragmatic, and undoubtedly still self-interested ally, but an ally nonetheless. The game, as I'd thought before, had indeed changed. The idea of Mark and me presenting a united front to anyone, let alone a high-powered law firm like Lockwood and Finch, was so foreign it bordered on the absurd. Our usual mode of communication involved carefully worded emails seemed irrelevant, or irrelevant, family members, or tense holiday dinners where the unspoken hung heavier than Mother's fruitcake. Yet, here we were, the following morning, huddled over my small kitchen table, a space usually reserved for my solitary tea and existential crises, strategizing. Right, Mark said, tapping a pen against a legal pad he'd produced from his briefcase. He looked more comfortable now, back in his element of planning and execution, even if the project was deciphering our mother's posthumous machinations. First, Henderson. He drafted the original will. He must know why Mother switched. Or at least, have some record of her dissatisfaction. I already spoke to him, Mark. I reminded him gently. He was as surprised as I was. Said Mother hadn't used his services for anything beyond updating her property tax filings for the last 5 years. He seemed genuinely hurt, actually. Mark frowned. Odd. Henderson was practically family. For Mother to sideline him like that. It suggests this Lockwood and Finch move was significant. Deliberate. Professor Finch, Mother's old colleague, confirmed Lockwood and Finch specialize in complex asset protection, often for clients wanting discretion, I offered. And Dr. Hayes from Asian Studies is translating those letters we found. She believes Mother had a significant, hidden relationship with this Lin Bai, dating back to before she married Dad. A relationship possibly severed by political circumstances in China. Mark absorbed this, his expression unreadable. The name Lynn no longer elicited a scoff, just a quiet, focused attention. The shift was palpable. So we have a secret love affair, a potential political upheaval, and a high-end law firm known for aggressive tactics, Mark summarized, a hint of his old sharp cynicism returning, but this time directed outwards, not at me. This is less an estate settlement and more a Cold War spy novel written by Jane Austen. Despite myself, I almost smiled. What's our next move then, O keeper of esoteric truths? He asked, a new, almost respectful teasing in his tone. I think, I said, it's time we paid a visit to Lockwood and Finch. Or at least tried to. Firms like that don't usually welcome bereaved children asking awkward questions about their secretive, deceased clients. Lockwood and Finch's offices were exactly as I'd imagined. All gleaming chrome, hushed carpets, and receptionists with polite, impenetrable smiles. It was a world designed to make you feel small, insignificant, and acutely aware of the billable hours ticking away. Our appointment, secured by Mark's impressive-sounding, and probably entirely fabricated, title at his own company, was with a junior associate named Miss Albright, no relation, I fervently hoped, whose primary skill seemed to be deflecting direct questions with an arsenal of perfectly phrased non-answers. We understand this is a difficult time for you both, Ms. Albright said, her voice smooth as polished marble. However, due to client confidentiality, we are unable to discuss the specifics of Mrs. Eleanor Miller's estate planning beyond the terms outlined in her legally executed last will and testament, a copy of which I believe you both possess. We're not questioning the legality of the will, Ms. Albright, Mark interjected, his CEO voice firmly in place. We're seeking to understand the broader context. The rationale. Were there trusts established? Other beneficiaries our mother may have wished to provide for, perhaps discreetly. Ms. Albright's smile didn't waver, but for a fleeting second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, a hesitation? A flicker of recognition at the mention of other beneficiaries? Or was I just projecting my own desperate hope for a clue? All of Mrs. Miller's testamentary wishes were fully and legally documented. She reiterated, a human recording. If there were other instruments or provisions, they would have been communicated through the appropriate channels at the appropriate time. Appropriate channels. Appropriate time. Mother's world, even in death, was a fortress of propriety and carefully managed information. We left Lockwood and Finch with nothing more than a glossy brochure and a profound sense of having hit a very expensive, very polished brick wall. Well, that was a dead end, Mark said, loosening his tie as we stepped out into the biting wind. Figured as much. These people are paid to be Fort Knox. Maybe not a complete dead end, I mused, thinking of Miss Albright's fleeting hesitation. She reacted to other beneficiaries. There is something more. Mother wouldn't have hired a firm like this for a simple will. Mark grunted. So what now, Sherlock? Stake out their offices? Go through their trash? A grin small and fierce touched my lips. Not quite. But I think it's time we looked more closely at Mother's own archives again. If she was protecting something or someone, there has to be a paper trail, however faint. And if anyone knew how to create or hide a paper trail, it was Eleanor Miller. The game, I realized, was far from over. It had just acquired a new formidable opponent. And this time, surprisingly, I wasn't playing it alone. The failed expedition to Lockwood and Finch, paradoxically, seemed to galvanize Mark. The impenetrable politeness of Ms. Albright had clearly offended his business sensibilities. If the direct approach wouldn't yield answers, he was now, it seemed, willing to consider less conventional, more forensic methods. The dusty academic stuff he'd previously dismissed was suddenly a potential goldmine of information, or at least leverage. All right, he declared, back in Mother's study, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt. If Eleanor was playing a deeper game, she would have kept records. Meticulous ones. She never trusted anyone entirely, not even her own shadow, probably. He started pulling boxes from the shelves with a new, focused energy. We're not just looking for Lynn anymore, Sarah. We're looking for anything with Lockwood and Finch's name on it. Anything related to trusts, endowments, offshore accounts. He trailed off, then added with a wry grimace. Or secret plum tree societies. I managed a small smile. His attempt at humor, however strained, was a welcome change. I'll keep an eye out for the horticultural conspiracies, I said, pulling down a box labeled Financials Pre-Retirement. The next few days were a blur of paper. Old bank statements, investment portfolios that made my head spin, tax returns stretching back to the Nixon era. Mark, in his element, deciphered complex financial jargon, muttering about amortization schedules and capital gains. I, meanwhile, scanned letters, diaries, though Mother's were frustratingly sparse and mostly about literary feuds or the declining standards of modern poetry, and personal correspondence, looking for names, dates, anything that resonated with the fragments we'd pieced together about Lin Bai or a hidden financial strategy. It was late on the third day of this paper chase, my eyes gritty with fatigue, that I found it. Not in the financials boxes, but tucked inside a thick volume of Montaigne's essays. A book Mother had often quoted on the virtues of stoicism and self-reliance. It was a single sheet of her heavy cream-colored stationery, folded precisely in thirds. On it, in her unmistakable, elegant script, was a list. No preamble. No explanation. Just a list of names and numbers. Lockwood and Finch annual retainer. A surprisingly large sum. The Lin Bai Endowment for Sino-American Artistic Exchange Seed Capital. An even larger sum. Trust of Finch. Plum Blossom Grove Maintenance Fund. Quaker Cemetery. A modest annual amount. Anonymous. Sarah E. Miller, Educational Trust. Dormant. Beneficiary upon my demise. M. Keith Miller, if primary heir unresponsive or incapable. Mark T. Miller, primary heir, residuary estate. My breath caught. I read it again, then a third time. Mark, alerted by my sudden silence, came over. I handed him the sheet without a word. He scanned it, his face paling. An endowment? For Lin Bai. With Alastair Finch as a trustee. He looked at me, his eyes wide. And, an educational trust for you, Sarah? Dormant? With me as the beneficiary if you were unresponsive. It was all there. The meticulous, almost cold-blooded planning. The large sums diverted, years ago, to purposes neither of us had known. The plum tree in the cemetery wasn't just a sentimental gesture. It was endowed. Lin Bai wasn't just a lost love. He was the beneficiary of a significant, ongoing financial commitment, managed by her trusted academic friend. And me, the educational trust, dormant, felt like a final posthumous slap. So uninspired, so incapable in her eyes, that even my potential inheritance needed a failsafe, a redirection to the sensible son if I proved too esoteric. Mark sank into Mother's armchair, the paper trembling in his hand. She never trusted me with the legacy part, did she? He said, his voice hollow. Not really. She set Finch up to manage the Lin Bai thing. She thought you wouldn't be capable of handling even your own trust, so it would default to me. He looked up, and for the first time, I saw not my arrogant younger brother, but a man confronting his own mother's profound, and perhaps wounding assessment of his character. She played us, Sarah. She played us both. Played us. Or perhaps, I thought, a new cold clarity dawning, she had simply written her own story, with her own protagonists and her own carefully calculated endings, and we were merely supporting characters, assigned roles we never understood, in a drama whose true plot was only now devastatingly coming to light. The house, the money, the tweed skirts, they were just props. The real inheritance was this. The crushing weight of a lifetime of secrets, and the dawning bitter understanding of a mother who was, even in death, an absolute, unyielding, and utterly unknowable enigma. The single sheet of cream-colored paper lay on Mother's desk between Mark and me, a testament to her intricate, almost breathtakingly manipulative foresight. The air in the study, which had moments before felt charged with discovery, now seemed thick with a shared, dazed disillusionment. We weren't just grieving a mother. We were grieving the mother we thought we knew, a simpler, more transparent entity who, it turned out, had never really existed. Mark, for once, seemed to have lost his capacity for glib comebacks or pragmatic solutions. He picked up the paper again, his brow furrowed not in calculation this time, but in a kind of pained disbelief. An educational trust dormant, defaulting to me if you were unresponsive or incapable? He let out a harsh, short laugh devoid of humor. She really had all the angles covered, didn't she? Even managed to insult us both from beyond the grave. His words, surprisingly, didn't sting as they might have a week ago. The personal slight of the dormant trust felt almost peripheral now, a minor detail in the grand Byzantine architecture of Mother's secret life. What consumed me was the sheer audacity of her planning, the decades of silent machinations, the Lindby endowment managed by Alastair Finch, the anonymous funding for a plum grove in a forgotten cemetery. This wasn't just about money. This was about a fierce, unyielding, and utterly secret devotion. The endowment for Lindby, I said, my voice quiet. That's a significant commitment. Ongoing. For Sino-American artistic exchange. I looked at Mark. She wanted his work, his memory to live on, to be supported, even if she couldn't be with him. Mark nodded slowly, still staring at the paper. And she used Finch, her old academic sparring partner, to make sure it happened, bypassing her own family entirely. He shook his head. What kind of love or guilt, or whatever it was, makes someone do that? It was a question neither of us could answer. But in that moment, looking at my brother's genuinely perplexed and yes, wounded face, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt for him in years. A reluctant, fragile kind of empathy. We were both just children of Eleanor Miller, trying to make sense of a legacy far more convoluted than either of us had bargained for. So Lockwood and Finch, I said, breaking the silence. Do we go back? Armed with this new information? Demand a full accounting of these trusts, these endowments? Mark was silent for a long moment. He finally looked up, his gaze meeting mine, stripped of its usual defenses. Honestly, Sarah, right now I care less about what those corporate sharks are doing and more about why. Why all this secrecy? Who was Lindby to her, really? What happened between them that made her build this secret financial shrine? His words resonated with the truth deep inside me. The house, the money. It all felt like a distraction now. The real inheritance, the real mystery, lay in that lacquered box, in the faded letters from San Francisco, in the sorrowful eyes of a man sketched in a hidden book, and in the meticulously planned endowments for a love no one knew existed. Dr. Hayes is still translating the letters, I said. She thinks there might be more clues there. About their relationship, the separation. Mark nodded. All right. Let's wait for that. Let's try to understand Mother's story first, before we declare war on her lawyers. He managed a faint, wry smile. Knowing Eleanor, she probably has traps laid for anyone who tries to dismantle her grand design too hastily. A shared, almost conspiratorial look passed between us. It was a look that acknowledged our mother's infuriating brilliance, her capacity for both profound love and breathtakingly complex subterfuge. So, I said, feeling a strange lightness despite the weight of it all, Operation Decipher Eleanor begins? Mark actually grinned. A genuine, unforced grin. Operation Decipher Eleanor. I like the sound of that. He stood up, suddenly looking less like a beleaguered heir and more like, well, like my brother. But you're in charge of the dusty academic stuff, Sarah. I'll handle the financial archaeology if it comes to that. For the first time in a very long time, the house didn't feel quite so haunted. It felt instead like the beginning of a very complicated, very Eleanor-esque adventure. Operation Decipher Eleanor, as Mark had wryly dubbed it, began with the letters. We spread them out on Mother's imposing mahogany desk, the fragile rice paper rustling like ancient secrets. Mark surprisingly suggested I read them aloud again slowly while he took notes. You have the context from Dr. Hayes, he'd said, a tacit admission of my headway in this unfamiliar territory. I'll listen for patterns, financial implications, anything Mother might have inadvertently revealed about her state of mind when she was dealing with Lockwood and Finch later. So I read. Lindby's words, full of longing, poetry, and a quiet, unyielding love for Yoon, filled the dusty study. I found my voice steadying as I navigated his elegant prose, the earlier emotional rawness giving way to a more focused analysis. Mark, true to his word, listened intently, his pen occasionally scratching on his legal pad. My dearest Union Cloud, one read. Today I saw a plum tree in Golden Gate Park. It was not the weeping mume of your secret garden, but for a moment, the scent of its blossoms carried me back across the uncrossable sea. Do you remember that day by the West Lake, when the boatman sang of separated lovers, and you whispered that our love would find its own melody, strong enough to bridge any distance? I hold on to that melody, my dearest, even as the silence here grows deafening. Okay, stop there, Mark interjected. Golden Gate, San Francisco, confirmed. Shared studio. Implies they had a physical space together before he left China, or was planning to. Significant emotional investment. He scribbled a note. Also, gilded cage. He wasn't entirely happy there. Financial strain, maybe? Did mother ever send money to San Francisco? I don't recall any such transactions in her checkbooks, I said, slightly irritated by his immediate leap to finances. I think he's speaking metaphorically, Mark. About loneliness. About being cut off from his art, his culture. Loneliness doesn't pay the rent, Sarah, he retorted, though without his usual bite. If he was struggling and mother knew, it could explain a lot about her wanting to provide for him, even posthumously. We continued like this for hours, dissecting Lynn's hopes, his despair, his unwavering affection for Eleanor. Then, in a letter dated late 1970, came a passage that made us both sit up. Your news about the fellowship, my dearest Yoon, is a beacon. That you would use such an opportunity, your own brilliant path, to try and find a way for us. It fills my heart with a hope I dared not entertain. If the university can sponsor my visa as a visiting artist, if only for a year, perhaps these uncrossed miles will finally shrink. The symposium proposal, Mark breathed, his eyes wide. The one I found in the archives. Poetics of Exile and Resilience. With Lynn Bai as a keynote. She wasn't just trying to give him a platform, Sarah. She was trying to bring him here. The pieces clicked together with a painful clarity. Mother, armed with her new fellowship, her growing academic standing, had tried to leverage her position to reunite with the man she loved. And she had failed. The rejection letters Mark had seen now felt like daggers to my own heart. Each one a fresh wound inflicted on Mother's secret, desperate hope. All those years, I whispered, thinking of Mother's relentless drive, her sometimes harsh ambition. All that work, that climbing the academic ladder, was it all for him? To get to a point where she had the power, the influence to make a difference for Lynn. And when it didn't work, Mark said, his voice heavy with a new understanding. When the university, the funding bodies all said no, what then? What does a woman like Eleanor Miller do when her most meticulously laid plans, her most passionate hopes, are crushed by indifferent bureaucracy? We sat in silence, the weight of Mother's 30-year-old heartbreak filling the room. The formidable scholar had been at her core. A woman fighting for love against impossible odds. And she had lost. She wouldn't have just given up, I said finally, the words a certainty in my own heart. Eleanor Miller didn't do giving up. If one door closed, she'd find a window, or if necessary, a stick of dynamite. If she couldn't bring Lynn here through official channels, she would have found another way. Private way. Lockwood and Finch. The endowment. The trust for me that defaults to you. Mark, what if it was never about us being incapable? He looked at me, waiting. What if, I said, the pieces falling into a new, terrifying and yet strangely coherent pattern? What if the entire will, the reason she put you in charge of the house and the bulk of the estate, the reason she set up that dormant trust for me, what if it was all a contingency plan? To ensure that if something happened to her, there were resources discreetly managed that could still somehow benefit Lynn Bai or his legacy without anyone, especially her own family, ever knowing the true extent of her lifelong secret devotion. The silence that followed was the most profound yet. Mark stared at me, his face a mask of stunned comprehension. The game hadn't just changed. The entire board had been flipped. Mark stared at me, the color draining from his face, leaving behind the stark architecture of his cheekbones. My theory that Mother's entire will, her dealings with Lockwood and Finch, even the baffling educational trust meant for me, were all part of an elaborate, decades-long contingency plan to benefit Lynn Bai, hung in the air between us, audacious and terrifyingly plausible. The silence in the study was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the sound of 2 lifetimes of assumptions shattering. That's insane, Sarah, he finally managed, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He paced the small space, running a hand through his hair again. No longer the smooth executive, but a man wrestling with a ghost far more substantial than he'd ever imagined. To build her entire financial endgame around a man she hadn't seen in possibly 50 years? A man none of us even knew existed? It's the plot of a Gothic novel, not Eleanor Miller's meticulously planned estate. Is it, though? I countered, surprisingly calm now that the theory was out in the open. The painted stones, the plum tree at the Quaker cemetery, the unsent letters she kept, Lynn's letters to her that she preserved, the symposium she tried to arrange. Was that not meticulous planning? A lifelong secret dedication? Why wouldn't her final act, her will, be the culmination of that same dedication, executed with the same formidable precision? He stopped pacing, looking at the list I'd found again. The Lynn by Endowment for Sino-American Artistic Exchange Seed Capital. An even larger sum. Trustee Finch. He tapped the line. Finch. She trusted Finch with this, not her own son, not her own financial advisor. There was a new note in his voice, not anger, but a kind of bewildered hurt. The favored son, it turned out, had also been kept outside the innermost sanctum of Eleanor Miller's heart and plans. All right, he said, his voice hardening with a new resolve, the businessman reasserting himself, but with a different target now. If your insane theory holds even a shred of water, Sarah, then Lockwood and Finch know. They have to know the full extent of these arrangements. The endowment, the trusts. If Mother was funneling significant assets towards this Lynn by, or his legacy, it would have required complex legal and financial maneuvering. That's their bread and butter. So we go back to Ms. Albright? I asked. Mark shook his head. Not Albright. She's a foot soldier. We need to talk to someone higher up. A senior partner. And we don't go in asking polite questions about broader context anymore. A predatory gleam entered his eye, the one I'd seen him use when closing a particularly tough deal. We go in with what we know. The endowment, Finch as trustee, the potential for undisclosed beneficiaries or prior claims on the estate. We suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be irregularities that could complicate probate significantly if not fully disclosed to all interested parties. I raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting we imply a legal challenge, Mark? I'm suggesting, he said, a tight, almost wolfish grin appearing, that we speak their language. The language of billable hours, potential litigation, and inconvenient public scrutiny. Mother may have been a formidable chess player, Sarah, but she's not the only Miller who knows how to play the game. He picked up his phone. I'll call Henderson. Tell him we have new information that requires urgent clarification from Lockwood and Finch's senior counsel regarding the full scope of our mother's estate planning and all associated trusts and endowments. Let's see how impenetrable they are when their own professional indemnity is on the line. I watched him, a strange mix of apprehension and admiration swirling within me. This was the Mark I'd seen in boardrooms, the one who could dissect a hostile takeover bid with surgical precision. The brother I'd often resented for his ruthless ambition was now, however reluctantly, pointing that ambition in a direction that might just lead to the truth. Mother had wanted her legacy protected. Perhaps in our own fumbling, conflicting ways, that's what Mark and I were finally trying to do. Not just the legacy of her published works or her property, but the legacy of a love so profound it had shaped a lifetime of secrets, and was now, even in death, reshaping the lives of the children she'd left behind. All right, Mark, I said, meeting his determined gaze. Let's play the game. The thought of facing down Lockwood and Finch was still daunting, but doing it with Mark Miller, the corporate bulldog, suddenly by my side, well, that felt like an entirely new and unexpectedly potent kind of alliance. Mark didn't waste any time. The moment we'd tacitly agreed on our new, slightly unnerving alliance, he was on the phone to Mr. Henderson. I listened, a reluctant admirer of his seamless shift from bewildered son to formidable businessman. There was no hint of the emotional turmoil of the past few days in his voice, only crisp, professional assertion. Henderson, it's Mark Miller, he began, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. Sarah and I have been reviewing Mother's affairs more closely. We've uncovered certain documents pertaining to financial arrangements made through Lockwood and Finch, including what appears to be a significant, previously undisclosed, endowed fund. We require full transparency. I expect you, as the executor of the primary will, to facilitate an urgent meeting with senior counsel at Lockwood and Finch to discuss these discrepancies and their potential impact on the probate process. Any resistance will be met with a formal legal challenge. Am I clear? There was a pause, during which I could almost hear poor Mr. Henderson sputtering on the other end. Henderson, who Mother had probably paid in homemade scones and literary pronouncements for 40 years, was now facing the full force of Mark T. Miller, CEO in everything but name. Mark listened for a moment, then said, "Excellent. I'll expect confirmation of that meeting by end of day. And Henderson? Get everything Eleanor Miller ever signed with Lockwood and Finch. Everything." He hung up, a predatory calm on his face. "Well," he said to me, "the bear has been officially poked. Let's see if it comes out roaring or bearing documents." Despite the gravity of the situation, a small, unwilling smile touched my lips. It was unsettling to see this side of Mark directed at someone other than me, but I couldn't deny its effectiveness. While Mark dealt with the legal skirmishing, I retreated back to Lindby's letters, Dr. Hayes having sent over translations of a few more fragments. Each one was a window into a soul both profoundly poetic and deeply wounded. "You and my cloud," one read. "Today I saw a plum tree in Golden Gate Park. It was not the weeping mume of your secret garden, but for a moment, the scent of its blossoms carried me back across the uncrossable sea. Do you remember that day by the West Lake, when the boatman sang of separated lovers, and you whispered that our love would find its own melody, strong enough to bridge any distance? I hold on to that melody, my dearest, even as the silence here grows deafening. A shared studio. A boatman's song by the West Lake. A secret garden where she planted his tree. These weren't the actions of a woman of formidable intellect, merely indulging a fleeting fancy. This was the cartography of a great defining love, and the indifferent bureaucracy that had crushed her hopes of bringing him here now felt like an active, malevolent force in her story. I thought of Mother's sharp critiques, her impatience with what she deemed emotional self-indulgence. Had it all been a defense mechanism? A way to armor a heart that had been so devastatingly broken? The realization was like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. The anger I'd felt over the will, over being overlooked, began to recede, replaced by an overwhelming, aching compassion for the young Eleanor Vance, the cloud who had loved a man named Lindby and lost him to the cruel machinations of history. Mark re-entered the study later that afternoon, his tie loosened, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Meeting set. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Senior Partner's office. Henderson is practically apoplectic, but he's also terrified of being implicated in anything irregular. Apparently, the threat of us going public with concerns about the handling of a prominent academic's estate did the trick. He actually looked pleased with himself. So we face the dragons in their den," I said, more to myself than to him. He caught my eye. "We do. And Sarah." He paused, an uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Mother's reasons were, she shouldn't have left you in the dark like that. About any of it." It was the closest Mark had ever come to an apology, or at least an acknowledgement of my pain. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The dragons of Lockwood and Finch were one thing. The ghosts of Eleanor Miller and Lindby were another entirely. And tomorrow it seemed we were walking into a battle on both fronts. But for the first time I didn't feel entirely alone in the fight. Mark, in his own complicated, infuriating and surprisingly steadfast way, was finally truly beside me. The offices of Lockwood and Finch were less an office and more a shrine to corporate power. Acres of polished marble, hushed tones, art that probably cost more than Mother's entire estate, and a view of the city that screamed, "We own this." Ms. Albright, the junior associate with the Teflon smile, was thankfully absent. We were ushered into a cavernous boardroom to meet Mr. Julian Price, senior partner, a man whose tailored suit probably had its own trust fund. He had the predatory stillness of a patient shark, all polite menace and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Miller, Ms. Miller," Price said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He didn't offer to shake hands. "Mr. Henderson conveyed your concerns. Though I must confess, the nature of those concerns remains somewhat nebulous." "Let's make them less nebulous, shall we, Mr. Price?" Mark began all business. He laid out our discovery of the Lindby endowment, Alastair Finch's name as trustee, and the significant, undisclosed sums involved. He didn't mention the letters, or Lindby's personal connection to Mother. This was strategy. Stick to the financials, the potential irregularities. Price listened, his expression unchanging, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. It was the smile of a man who had dealt with far larger, Far more aggressive challenges than two bewildered adult children questioning their mother's perfectly legal will. The Eleanor Miller Philanthropic Trust, as it's formally known, Price corrected smoothly when Mark finished, is a private charitable entity established by Mrs. Miller some years ago. Its disbursements and governance are entirely in accordance with her explicit, legally documented wishes, and overseen by the designated trustee, Professor Finch. All perfectly above board, I assure you. An endowment so above board that neither of her children, nor her long-standing personal solicitor, were made aware of its existence or its substantial seed capital until after her death? I interjected, unable to maintain my silence. Doesn't that strike you as unusual, Mr. Price? For a woman who, by all accounts, was meticulous about her affairs. Price's gaze flickered towards me, a brief assessment, then back to Mark. Mrs. Miller valued her privacy, Ms. Miller, especially in matters she considered deeply personal. Her instructions regarding the trust were quite explicit on the matter of discretion, particularly concerning family members until such time as the trust was fully activated post-mortem. Deeply personal. Discretion concerning family members. The words, though couched in legalese, were a confirmation. This wasn't just about Sino-American artistic exchange. This was about Lin-Bai, in a way that Mother had fiercely, expensively guarded. Discretion is one thing, Mr. Price, Mark said, leaning forward. Obfuscation that could lead to significant delays in probate. Potential challenges to the primary will based on undisclosed prior commitments of the estate, not to mention reputational damage to a firm of your standing should these discreet arrangements become public in a less than favorable light. That's quite another. It was a masterclass in veiled threats. I almost admired him. Price's smile didn't falter. Lockwood and Finch has always acted with the utmost probity and in full accordance with our client's instructions, Mr. Miller. The Eleanor Miller Philanthropic Trust is a legally sound entity. Its purpose noble. Its administration impeccable under Professor Finch. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, of course, any legitimate heir has the right to request a formal accounting of an estate's disbursements. Such requests, naturally, follow a specific legal protocol. He slid a ridiculously thick brochure across the table. Our probate litigation department can guide you, should you choose that path. Though frankly, it can be a rather protracted and costly endeavor. It was a polite, ironclad dismissal. We had confirmed the trust, confirmed Finch's involvement, and confirmed that Lockwood and Finch would yield nothing more without a formal, expensive fight. Mark's face was tight with frustration. As we stood to leave, a thought struck me, a whisper from the Eleanor who had filled countless notebooks with her intricate thoughts. Mr. Price, I said, turning back. This trust, it was established before the final will that benefits my brother, wasn't it? Some years before. Price hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. All testamentary documents and associated trusts were established in accordance with Mrs. Miller's evolving wishes and legal counsel. Ms. Miller. Evolving wishes. Not a direct answer. But enough. Outside, the city air felt sharp and cold. Stonewalled, Mark growled. Completely stonewalled. Not completely, I said, thinking. He confirmed the trust was set up before this final will. Years before, if Finch is the trustee and she discussed it with him. Which means, this wasn't a last-minute decision to disinherit me, Mark. This was part of a much older, much more deliberate plan. The will leaving you the house. That was the final piece she put in place, not the first. Mark stopped on the sidewalk, staring at me. So, what you're saying is, the main event, the big financial move, was always for Lin-Bai. And the will that shocked us so much, we were just the epilogue. The bewilderment was back, stronger than ever. And this time it was a bewilderment I fully shared. The scale of Mother's secret, her lifelong dedication to this hidden love, was only just beginning to dawn. The failed expedition to Lockwood and Finch, paradoxically, seemed to galvanize Mark. The impenetrable politeness of Ms. Albright had clearly offended his business sensibilities. If the direct approach wouldn't yield answers, he was now, it seemed, willing to consider less conventional, more forensic methods. The dusty academic stuff he'd previously dismissed was suddenly a potential goldmine of information, or at least leverage. All right, he declared, back in Mother's study, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt. If Eleanor was playing a deeper game, she would have kept records. Meticulous ones. She never trusted anyone entirely, not even her own shadow probably. He started pulling boxes from the shelves with a new focused energy. We're not just looking for Lynn-by anymore, Sarah. We're looking for anything with Lockwood and Finch's name on it. Anything related to trusts, endowments, offshore accounts. He trailed off, then added with a wry grimace, or secret plum tree societies. I managed a small smile. His attempt at humor, however strained, was a welcome change. I'll keep an eye out for the horticultural conspiracies, I said, pulling down a box labeled Financials Pre-Retirement. The next few days were a blur of paper. Old bank statements, investment portfolios that made my head spin, tax returns stretching back to the Nixon era. Mark, in his element, deciphered complex financial jargon, muttering about amortization schedules and capital gains. I, meanwhile, scanned letters, diaries, though Mother's were frustratingly sparse and mostly about literary feuds or the declining standards of modern poetry, and personal correspondence, looking for names, dates, anything that resonated with the fragments we'd pieced together about Lynn-by or a hidden financial strategy. It was late on the third day of this paper chase, my eyes gritty with fatigue, that I found it. Not in the financials boxes, but tucked inside a thick volume of Montaigne's essays. A book Mother had often quoted on the virtues of stoicism and self-reliance. It was a single sheet of her heavy cream-colored stationery, folded precisely in thirds. On it, in her unmistakable, elegant script, was a list. No preamble. No explanation. Just a list of names and numbers. Lockwood and Finch annual retainer. A surprisingly large sum. The Lynn-by endowment for Sino-American Artistic Exchange seed capital. An even larger sum. Tressive Finch. Plum Blossom Grove Maintenance Fund. Quaker Cemetery. A modest annual amount. Anonymous. Sarah E. Miller, Educational Trust. Dormant. Beneficiary upon my demise. M. D. Miller, if primary heir unresponsive or incapable. Mark T. Miller, primary heir, residuary estate. My breath caught. I read it again, then a third time. Mark, alerted by my sudden silence, came over. I handed him the sheet without a word. He scanned it, his face paling. An endowment? For Lynn-by. With Alistair Finch as a trustee. He looked at me, his eyes wide. And, an educational trust for you, Sarah? Dormant? With me as the beneficiary if you were unresponsive. It was all there. The meticulous, almost cold-blooded planning. The large sums diverted, years ago, to purposes neither of us had known. The plum tree in the cemetery wasn't just a sentimental gesture. It was endowed. Lynn-by wasn't just a lost love. He was the beneficiary of a significant, ongoing financial commitment, managed by her trusted academic friend. And me. The educational trust, dormant, felt like a final posthumous slap. So uninspired, so incapable in her eyes, that even my potential inheritance needed a failsafe, a redirection to the sensible son if I proved too esoteric. Mark sank into Mother's armchair, the paper trembling in his hand. She never trusted me with the legacy part, did she? He said, his voice hollow. Not really. She set Finch up to manage the Lynn-by thing. She thought you wouldn't be capable of handling even your own trust, so it would default to me. He looked up, and for the first time, I saw not my arrogant younger brother, but a man confronting his own mother's profound, and perhaps wounding assessment of his character. She played us, Sarah. She played us both. Played us. Or perhaps, I thought, a new cold clarity dawning, she had simply written her own story, with her own protagonists and her own carefully calculated endings, and we were merely supporting characters, assigned roles we never understood, in a drama whose true plot was only now devastatingly coming to light. The house, the money, the tweed skirts, they were just props. The real inheritance was this. The crushing weight of a lifetime of secrets, and the dawning bitter understanding of a mother who was, even in death, an absolute, unyielding, and utterly unknowable enigma. The study, once a silent battleground, now felt more like a field hospital after a long, exhausting campaign. The list detailing Mother's secret endowments lay between Mark and me, an artifact unearthed from the ruins of our lifelong assumptions. The air was still, heavy with the weight of 50 years of unspoken love and loss. Mark, for the first time I could recall, seemed utterly devoid of his usual corporate bluster. He just looked tired, and strangely younger. "So, Alistair Finch," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "He's the trustee for this Lynn-by endowment." He picked up the list, his finger tracing the line. Mother trusted him. Implicitly, it seems. More than she trusted her own children with this particular passion. There was no bitterness in his voice now, only a kind of weary acceptance. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. "She knew him from her academic world," I offered. "Perhaps she saw him as someone who would understand the artistic and cultural significance. Someone who would honor Lynn's memory in the way she intended, without personal complications. The unspoken personal complications being, of course, us. Her children with our own needs, our own histories with her, our own potential to misunderstand or mismanage something so deeply precious to her." "So, what's the protocol here?" Mark asked, looking at me. It was still a novel experience, him asking for my lead. "Do we call Finch? Inform him that we know? Ask him about Lynn-by? About the full extent of this endowment?" This was the crux. The endowment, according to Mother's note, was already ceded. Finch was its trustee. Legally, we probably had no standing beyond a vague familial curiosity. But emotionally, this felt like the heart of everything. "I don't think we demand anything, Mark," I said slowly. "Not yet. I think I'd like to talk to Professor Finch again. Not as an heir questioning a will, but as Eleanor Miller's daughter, trying to understand a part of her life I never knew. To understand Lynn-by. To understand what she hoped this endowment would achieve." Mark nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Respect? Regret? All right, Sarah. You talk to him. Find out what you can about Lynn. About this story." He paused, then added, his voice surprisingly gentle. "And the house, the quitclaim deeds. Henderson can wait. There's no rush on that anymore. Not until we understand this." It was a significant concession. For Mark, the man of deadlines and bottom lines, to willingly postpone the settlement of an estate, to prioritize understanding over financial expediency. It was nothing short of a seismic shift. I called Alistair Finch the next morning. My request was different this time. No veiled inquiries about legal firms or asset protection. I simply told him that Mark and I had discovered further evidence of Mother's deep, lifelong connection to someone named Lynn-by, and that we were hoping to understand more about him, about Mother's relationship with him, and about her intentions for the endowment she had established in his name. His response was immediate and warm. "Sarah, my dear, I was wondering when you might circle back to the heart of the matter. Eleanor's literary legacy was always more than just her published words. Come by my home tomorrow afternoon. There are some things, some stories that are better shared over tea, not in a formal office." His home. Not the faculty club. This felt different. More personal. As if I were finally being invited, not into Eleanor Miller the formidable academic, but into the private world of Yoon, the woman who had loved a man named Lynn-by enough to build a secret monument to him in her heart, and in her meticulously planned will. The next afternoon couldn't come soon enough. The boxes in the study, filled with the detritus of Mother's public life, seemed to fade in importance. It was the unseen, the unspoken, the legacy of Lynn-by and the cloud who had loved him, that now held all the answers I so desperately sought. And for the first time I felt Mark was, in his own way, seeking them too. Professor Finch's home was not what I expected. Unlike Mother's house, which felt like a meticulously curated museum of intellect, Finch's was a comfortable, slightly chaotic haven of books, art, and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco and Earl Grey tea. It was the home of a man who lived with his passions, not one who kept them under lock and key. He greeted me at the door himself, a cardigan thrown casually over his shirt, his eyes kind and unhurried. "Sarah, come in," he said, ushering me into a study that overflowed with even more books than Mother's. "Tea? Or something a little stronger to fortify you for tales of Eleanor Miller's rather unconventional heart?" I opted for tea. The unconventional heart was intriguing enough without alcoholic embellishment. Once settled with a steaming cup of Darjeeling in my hands, I didn't need to prompt him. He seemed to understand what I was there for, what Mark and I were grappling with. Eleanorian, as Lynn-by called her, was a woman of profound and profoundly guarded passions. Finch began, his gaze distant, as if summoning memories from a long-ago landscape. Their connection, hers and Lin-Bai's, was one of those rare incandescent things. A meeting of minds, yes, but also, I believe, a true meeting of souls. He told me about Lin-Bai, the brilliant young artist and poet who had arrived at the university on that short-lived exchange program, full of dreams and a quiet, captivating talent. He spoke of Eleanor, then a fiercely ambitious doctoral candidate, equally captivated, finding in Lin not just an intellectual equal but someone who saw past her formidable defenses to the vulnerable, yearning woman within. They were inseparable that year, Finch said, a wistful smile touching his lips. Debating poetry in the campus coffee shop until dawn, sketching by the river, sharing ridiculous, hopeful plans for a future where art and intellect could bridge any divide. Eleanor, she was different then. Lighter. More open. And then, I prompted gently. Finch's smile faded. And then the world intruded. The political situation in China became untenable for someone like Lin-Bai, whose family had a problematic intellectual background. His permission to stay, to teach, to even correspond freely was rescinded. He was, in essence, stranded in San Francisco, his future uncertain, his connection to his homeland severed, and his ability to build a life with Eleanor impossible. He paused, the silence heavy with the weight of that long-ago heartbreak. Eleanor fought, Sarah. Oh, how she fought. The symposium proposal Mark found? That was just one of many attempts. She wrote letters, pulled strings, lobbied anyone she thought might listen. But it was a different era. Doors were closed. Walls were high. And the endowment? I asked, my voice hushed. Lockwood and Finch? Finch nodded. When it became clear that Lin-Bai would likely never be able to return, and that his own artistic career was precarious, given his situation, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't bring him here, but she could, in her own way, try to support his spirit, his art, his legacy. She began very quietly, very strategically, to build her own fortress, as you put it when we last spoke. Not for herself, Sarah, but for him. He explained how over decades Eleanor had meticulously saved, invested, and planned, always with the goal of creating a substantial, anonymous fund that could support Sino-American artistic exchange, subtly championing the kind of work Lin-Bai represented, keeping his cultural heritage alive, even if his name couldn't always be directly attached due to political sensitivities. Lockwood and Finch were chosen for their expertise in discreet, complex international philanthropy. And the will? I asked, almost afraid of the answer. Mark and me. She knew she couldn't entrust this lifelong, secret mission directly to either of you. Not without burdening you with its complexities or risking its exposure, Finch said gently. She needed someone with financial acumen and a degree of detachment to manage the bulk of the estate, to ensure its stability so the Lin-Bai endowment could be perpetually funded. That was Mark's designated role, whether he knew the full why or not. And you, Sarah? He looked at me, his eyes full of a sudden profound understanding. The dormant educational trust that defaulted to Mark if you were unresponsive or incapable. That wasn't an insult, my dear. That was Eleanor's clumsy, terrified way of protecting you. She feared that if you knew the full extent of her financial commitment to Lin-Bai's legacy, you, with your good heart and perhaps less ruthless financial sense, might sacrifice your own security for it. Or that you might be drawn into the complexities, the potential heartaches, of a past that wasn't yours to carry directly. The room swam. It was too much. My mother, the woman I had resented for her coldness, for her criticisms, for her final seemingly cruel act of disinheritance, had done it all, every meticulous, infuriating, heartbreaking step, out of a love so vast it had spanned continents and decades, and a fierce protective instinct for a memory, a legacy, and yes, even for her own children, however imperfectly expressed. The assistance I had provided wasn't a footnote. It had allowed her the space, the peace of mind, to build this secret monument. Tears, hot and unexpected, finally spilled over. Not tears of anger or betrayal this time, but tears of a shattering, overwhelming and profoundly healing understanding. Alistair Finch simply pushed a box of tissues towards me. His silence a respectful witness to a daughter finally, truly, meeting her mother. The game Eleanor Miller had played wasn't against her children. It was against time, against politics, against oblivion. And in her own fiercely guarded, astonishingly complex way, she had perhaps found a way to win. The question that remained was how Mark and I, the unwitting players in her long game, would now choose to honor her victory and Lin-Bai's enduring song. I returned to Mother's house later that evening, the lacquered box containing Lin-Bai's letters and stones feeling less like a mystery and more like a sacred trust. The conversation with Alistair Finch had unspooled the tangled threads of Eleanor Miller's life, revealing a pattern of such fierce, hidden devotion that it left me breathless, humbled, and with an aching tenderness for the mother I had only just begun to know. Mark was in the study, surrounded by the same boxes, but the restless energy was gone. He looked up as I entered, his face etched with a weary anticipation. He didn't ask about my meeting with Finch. He simply waited. The power dynamic between us had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the pragmatic heir apparent. I was no longer the aggrieved, overlooked daughter. We were just two people trying to understand a legacy far larger than either of us. I didn't offer preamble. I just told him everything. About Lin-Bai, the young artist the Cloud Mother had loved. About the political turmoil that had torn them apart. About her decades of secret mourning. Her meticulous, anonymous support for his artistic heritage through the endowment. About the plum grove in the Quaker cemetery. And finally about Finch's interpretation of the will. Her fierce, clumsy attempt to protect that legacy, and to protect us, her children, from burdens she felt we weren't equipped to carry, or from truth she couldn't bring herself to share while alive. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the lacquered box I'd placed on the desk. When I finished, the silence in the room was profound, not empty, but filled with the weight of a life finally understood. He picked up one of the painted stones. Joy, and turned it over and over in his fingers. So all this time, he said, his voice raspy. All her sharpness, her demands, her distance, it was all this? He gestured vaguely, encompassing the letters, the stones, the 50 years of hidden grief. She was carrying that. Alone. A single tear traced a path down his usually impassive face. It was the first time I had ever seen my brother cry. And in that tear I saw not weakness, but the cracking of a carefully constructed facade, revealing a vulnerability that mirrored my own. The house, Mark, I said softly. The will. What do we do now? He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, clear and surprisingly direct. The house, it was never really about the house, was it? Not for her. And maybe not for us anymore either. He took a deep breath. The Lin-Bai endowment. That's her real will, isn't it? That's her true legacy. He stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the darkening garden. Lockwood and Finch can continue to manage the trust as she instructed Finch. We ensure it's honored properly. He turned back. As for the rest, the house, her personal assets, we follow the will as written, Sarah. I'll inherit the house. But, he paused, and for the first time a genuine, unforced smile touched his lips. But I think its first official act as my house will be to host a small, very private exhibition. Eleanor Vance and Lin-Bai. A love in letters and sketches. We can use the funds from the assistance she left you to frame his drawings properly. Tears welled in my own eyes, but these were different from the angry, betrayed tears of weeks past. These were tears of a complex, bittersweet release. Mark, in his own way, had understood. He had seen. I think Yuen would have liked that very much, I whispered. We didn't become best friends overnight, Mark and I. Decades of distance couldn't be erased in a few days of shared revelation. But something had shifted. The gentle rift had been acknowledged, and a fragile bridge was being built, stone by painted stone, across the chasm of our mother's secrets. In the weeks that followed, as the legalities were sorted with a new shared understanding and without contention, I found myself returning to that box of my old editorial notes. The forgotten women artists of the Renaissance proposal no longer felt like a monument to a failed ambition. Felt possible. Different. Mine. I still visited the plum grove in the Quaker cemetery. Sometimes I would bring one of Lynn's translated letters and read it aloud, the words mingling with the rustle of oak leaves and the scent of damp earth. It wasn't a place of sorrow anymore. It was a place of profound, enduring love. A place of understanding. Mother had always quoted Shakespeare. The readiness is all. I'd never truly understood what she meant. Not until now. She had spent a lifetime preparing a legacy, guarding a love, making choices that were, in their own agonizing way, a testament to her readiness to face loss and protect what mattered most to her. And in finally understanding her, I found I was at last ready for my own life. Ready to pick up my own pen, not to critique but to create. Ready for my own esoteric passions. Ready for whatever came next. The silence in her house was no longer an accusation. It was an invitation. And this time I was ready to answer its call.